Upper Three's presence loomed over them, pressing down on them like the air before a thunderstorm. Heavy with power and potential energy waiting to explode into violence. Kyajuro's shoulders tensed as if straining against that weight. Then Upper Three was moving. His right fist flashed downwards towards Yoriichi's head. Yoriichi started to bring his sword up, but Kyajuro was ready for the attack. His blade flicked out in a red blur and cut off the demon's fist. The demon hopped back a few yards, a slow smile spreading across its features. Its fist had already grown back. "Quite the fine blade," it commented. Its eyes were fixed on Kyajuro with a strange hunger. It had attacked Yoriichi first, but now all of its attention was on Kyajuro. Had the attack been a test? A way to sound out Kyajuro's reaction speed. "Why did you go after a wounded person over me?" Kyajuro asked. Upper Three grinned. "I thought he might get in the way of our little chat is all. What do you wish to discuss?" "Fair warning, I already dislike you," Kyajuro said. The demon didn't seem bothered. Its wide grin remained fixed in place. "Do you want to know what I despise? Weak human beings. The mere sight of them makes my skin crawl," Upper Three said. His eyes went pointedly to Yoriichi for a moment, a brief look of distaste coloring his features. "If that is true, I don't think we shall ever get along," Kyajuro replied. "I can tell by looking at you that you are strong. You are a Hashira, huh? Your fighting spirit is strong and tempered like quality steel. What is your name?" As Kyajuro replied to the demon, Akaza was the name it gave itself. Yoriichi's mind caught on the last part of the demon's reply about the fighting spirit. Did the demon's ability mean it could see Kyajuro's presence somehow like Yoriichi could? "All that strength will go to waste if you die here. Become a demon, Kyajuro. Do so and your strength will evolve over hundreds of years. You can reach the pinnacle of all you were meant to be," Akaza said. The words sent a thrill of horror through Yoriichi. He focused on the demon again. Its eyes were fixed on Kyajuro, its demeanor amused and relaxed. But it had to have seen it, right? Or why would it ask that question? Yoriichi told himself to start moving. To get up and take up his sword. He knew what was about to happen and he couldn't stand by and watch. Not again. Human lives are all the more precious because they are like a candle flame, Kyajuro said. They are easily twisted and moved in different directions by forces beyond their control. Sometimes they shine brightly, sometimes they sputter. Their very existence is fragile, in danger of being snuffed out by a strong breeze. But their changeability and fragility make each moment priceless. Something unique and never to be repeated. True strength is more than just the physical body. It is shining on in the darkness, even when it threatens to swallow you, Kyajuro said. This boy is not weak. He has come face to face with his fragility over and over again, yet he still strives on. Do not insult him. Burn this into your mind, demon. The two of us will never agree. Your twisted reasons cannot change that. No matter what you do or say, I will not yield. Akaza frowned and the amusement vanished from its presence for a moment, leaving behind only the roiling, barely contained thunderstorm. Very well, Akaza said. It stamped its foot down, shattering the earth beneath and struck a fighting pose. Akaza's presence seemed to spread out around it in a complicated web of lines. I'll just have to kill you then, Akaza said. Kyajuro didn't wait for the demon to attack. He charged forward and Akaza mirrored the movement, pushing off one foot and flying at Kyajuro. Yoriichi pushed himself to knees, his eyes fixed on the fight. The demon's last declaration had given him a small flicker of hope. Maybe there wasn't anything to see or the demon hadn't seen it yet. Maybe his fears were wrong. Maybe. But likely not. From what Yoriichi could see of the impossibly fast fight, Kyajuro was using the greater reach of his blade to his advantage. He struck with the end of the blade, so he could slash at the demon and avoid the demon's attacks at the same time. The demon for its part seemed to be fighting exclusively with its fists. It saved its powerful legs for springing around Kyajuro and adding more momentum to its attacks. The demon's movements were fast, so fast that even a month ago, Yoriichi would have strained to keep track of each individual move, even with the transparent world. Yet there was something about them that was languid and overly precise. Like the demon was being lazy and only using enough strength to get by. It kept up its conversation with Kyajuro easily, reasoning and taunting in turn as they fought. Akaza is toying with Kyajuro, Yoriichi realized. It isn't fighting at full strength because it doesn't have to. Kyajuro is not a match for it. Kyajuro's forehead and face appeared unmarked, which meant the flame Hashira was not yet fighting at his full strength either. That did not provide Yoriichi much comfort. Kyajuro hadn't trained in his marked state yet, which meant all the strength and speed it gave would be raw potential at best. Worse still, the demon had yet to show its blood demon art. Akaza and Kyajuro suddenly separated. The demon leaped away from Kyajuro and hung upside down in the air for a moment. It punched the air and Kyajuro stumbled backwards a few steps, as if struck. Yoriichi's eyes widened. As Akaza had punched, its presence had gathered around its fists and then shot out to attack Kyajuro. Somehow, the demon could use its very presence to attack, and its presence was large and powerful to begin with. As it continued to attack with its presence, Kyajuro unleashed a flame-breathing move that created a streak of flames between him and the attacks. Akaza changed the direction of its attacks and Kyajuro repeated the move. Since he can sense presences, he can see when Akaza attacks with his presence, Yoriichi realized. That is how he is surviving. Kyajuro finished blocking a last series of invisible attacks and then charged toward Akaza in a burst of speed and flame. He swung at Akaza's neck, but Akaza dodged the blow easily and answered with a flurry of fists. The fight continued for several more moments in close quarters. Kyajuro was keeping up, but Akaza's movements remained languid. The demon was still treating the fight like a game, and the fight would end swiftly when it decided it had enough. Yoriichi had finally managed to get to his feet. Inosuke had joined him at some point while he was distracted, and they both watched the Hashira and the upper-level demon. Kyajuro is going to lose, Yoriichi thought. The second that demon gets serious, he'll lose. I have to intervene or... Kyajuro seemed to sense Yoriichi's intent. He cast a quick glance over his shoulder and said, "Stay back. Your wound could kill you if it reopens." The demon shouted at Kyajuro to pay attention, but it didn't take advantage of the Hashira's momentary lapse in attention. It likely did not want the fight to end so soon. The next series of attacks from the demon were faster than the initial ones. Kyajuro managed to block, deflect, or dodge most of the attacks, but one grazed his left temple, opening up a slowly bleeding cut. It was the first blood the demon had drawn through the exchange. The demon began to step up its attacks along with its attempts to convince Kyajuro to willingly become a demon. It was creating more openings and allowing Kyajuro to land more attacks. With its rate of healing, though, those injuries hardly impacted the fight. I have to get in there, Yoriichi thought. But they are moving so fast and the demon isn't even at its top speed yet. How do I help Kyajuro instead of getting the way? A powerful punch sailed under Kyajuro's guard and hit his midsection with bone-breaking force. The Hashira winced and gave a grunt. It was obvious from how he held himself that several of his ribs must have broken. He leaped back into the fight and managed to cut off both Akaza's arms, but the arms grew back quickly and Akaza landed a blow on Kyajuro's left eye that made it immediately seal shut. The demon and the Hashira pulled several feet apart. Kyajuro stood with his back to Yoriichi. His breaths were loud and heavy, his feet shook slightly, and a few droplets of blood spilled from his head to the ground. It's not over yet. You can't die on me, Akaza said. Then, Yoriichi felt it. Kyajuro's presence surged and shone many times bright than before, like a sun that had come out from behind a cloud. Yoriichi couldn't see his face, but he knew what he would see, the mark. It had taken some time. Longer than Yoriichi thought it should have. Now it had manifested again, and with it had come hope. Kyajuro launched himself at Akaza again, this time moving with a speed that surprised even the demon. As Yoriichi watched, the languidness fell from Akaza's posture. Its attacks became crisp and efficient, dozens of punches made in the time it had taken for 1 mere seconds ago. The demon was no longer chatting as it fought, all of its concentration now going into its attacks. The wild grin it had worn the entire time was gone, but Yoriichi could feel a savage thrill in its presence. If anything, that thrill had increased at the presence of an opponent who could truly challenge it. Unfortunately, Yoriichi realized with a sinking heart. It wasn't going to be enough. Slowly, but surely, Akaza was gaining the upper hand again, and Kyajuro had no more surprises to turn the fight around. His injuries were slowing him down, and the unexpected burst of speed and stamina was taking away from the efficiency of his movements. Strikes that would have landed were now off by an inch or two. Then it happened. Kyajuro and Akaza separated from a moment after a particular violent series of attacks, and Akaza's eyes fixed for a moment on something near Kyajuro's collarbone. Its eyes widened and it appeared surprised, yet it still blocked and dodged Kyajuro's attacks. The two disengaged, and Akaza stared at Kyajuro for a moment more and then said, "It would seem the choice is out of my hands." All the playfulness had gone from its voice now. It seemed focused and ready. Kyajuro readied for another attack, his presence growing painfully bright as he focused all of his being on one single attack. He knew as well as Yoriichi did that Akaza was wearing him down. Now was the time to hit it with his best shot. Dawn was coming. Yoriichi guessed that it was 30 minutes at most away. Looking at the two adversaries, Yoriichi realized it wouldn't come soon enough to help Kyajuro. Akaza fully intended to end this in one final attack. Yoriichi began to move. For Akaza, the night had already been thrilling. Finding the boy with Hanafuda earrings that Lord Muzan wanted killed had been a stroke of luck. He'd had hopes that a human who attracted Lord Muzan's attention would be strong, but with a presence so weak, it barely registered as more than a plant. The boy was a serious disappointment. That hadn't mattered much because there was a Hashira with the boy. The Hashira's presence was brighter and stronger than many of the Hashira Akaza had fought in centuries. The first exchanges had been fun and promising, enough that he wished desperately Kyajuro would take his offer. Such beautiful strength and skill shouldn't have to vanish from the world because its owner was too stubborn and prideful to accept immortality. It was a necessity, though, and Akaza would have to make do with enjoying the pinnacle of the strength before destroying it. Then something unexpected had happened. Strange marks had appeared on Kyajuro's face, almost indistinguishable from the blood spattered across it from earlier wounds. The Hashira's strength and speed had grown, so much so that Akaza found himself having to truly put effort into a fight for the first time he could remember. With each strike came a small thrill of fear. He didn't know if he was fast enough to dodge the blows or deflect the blade. At times, the blade dug into the skin close to his collarbone or slashed through his shoulder, dangerously close to his neck. For a time, Akaza wondered if this was it. If he'd finally found a Hashira he couldn't beat. That thought didn't last long. Despite the increased power, speed, and even agility Kyajuro seemed to have gained, his precision was lower. It created small gaps that Akaza could and did capitalize on. During one of those gaps, Akaza spotted it on Kyajuro's chest, close to his collarbone. He silently cursed himself for getting so excited because this was exactly the kind of detail he should have noticed from the beginning of the fight. He had nearly made a very costly mistake. As Kyajuro stood before him, an enticing presence shining brighter and brighter as he prepared to attack again, Akaza readied himself. Dawn was close and he had to finish this fight now so he could do what had to be done. Akaza sprang forward and Kyajuro charged, fire gathering around him in a majestic dragon shape. The two crashed together in a flurry of blows. Kyajuro slashed at Akaza's arm and chopped it off at the elbow. Akaza jabbed at Kyajuro and barely missed hitting him. Kyajuro's flaming sword tore a path to his neck only to be deflected down and into the demon's shoulder by a strike from Akaza. When Kyajuro's blade bit deep into Akaza's neck, the demon saw his opening. The punch he sent at Kyajuro's stomach would be the blow that ended the fight. The demon carefully measured the force behind it to receive exactly the effect he wanted. The punch never landed. A blade, a deeper crimson than any Akaza had seen in a sword before, sliced through Akaza's arm. Akaza's forearm and fist tumbled off into the grass. Eyes widening slightly in shock, Akaza found himself looking into the face of the boy with Hanafuda earrings. It should not have been possible for the brat to scratch his skin. Not with how weak his fighting spirit felt. The arm on the ground proved that Akaza had, for the first time he could remember, wrongly judged how strong a human was. Shock turned to anger and Akaza snarled at the boy. Kyajuro and I are in the middle of something. Wait your turn like a good little boy. The boy looked the demon straight in the eyes. His expression was blank, but his eyes bore into Akaza with a cold, immense fury. No, the boy said. Akaza growled and then hissed as Kyajuro pulled on the sword embedded in his neck. Your fight is with me, not him, Kyajuro said. Tanjiro, get back. You are injured. It would be too dangerous for you to intervene. Listen to him, boy, Akaza said. You might last longer if you run now. You might even get to live. No, the boy said. I am not running away. I have done too much of that. Even when people suffered and died because I ran, I still turned away. I refuse to do that anymore. Before Akaza could react to that, Kyajuro began pushing on the blade in the demon's neck with all his might. Akaza felt it shift a few inches. Amazing. Even on the brink of death, Kyajuro could still eke out a little more strength. What had to happen to the Hashira would truly be regrettable. First, he had to get rid of the annoying brat. Leaping backward, Akaza struck Kyajuro's blade with his remaining hand. The sword snapped with a loud ring and Akaza was free to put some distance between himself, Kyajuro and the brat. Kyajuro's legs shook and he started forward, only for the brat to get in the way again. Akaza looked down and saw to his surprise that his fist had only just regenerated. Somehow, the brat's wound had taken longer to heal. It was healed now, though, and he was ready to fight. Akaza leaped at him and fired off a punch at the brat's head. One blow was all it would take and the distraction would have his head blown off. The punch slammed into the brat's blade and stopped dead. Then the brat met his eyes and spoke. Yorichi didn't need to reach far to find the words. Out of all the memories from his past life, this one was replayed the most. So many times he'd wondered if he could have said something differently, done something differently. If he could have somehow squeezed out a bit more strength or speed. If there was some way he could have changed the outcome all those centuries ago. So now, as the words came out, they seemed less spoken and more released. Like they had been itching to get out and just now burst free. Such disregard for human life. What is so amusing about this, he said. Akaza pulled back and snarled. I don't recall saying anything about finding this funny. But I will find the sight of your corpse gratifying. The demon attacked again, this time with both fists. Yorichi dodged its attacks as he spoke the next words. So tell me then. What exactly is the weight of a human life to you? The demon struck Yorichi's sword again and cracks appeared along the blade. Akaza started to speak and then froze, a look of confusion on his face. Yorichi felt the trickle of malicious energy present throughout Akaza's speech turn into a torrent. Kibutsuji had been watching before. Now his whole attention was fixed on the fight, staring out at Yorichi from behind Upper Three's yellow eyes. Akaza's next punch came too fast for Yorichi to do more than block. Yorichi's blade creaked from the strain, but his eyes bore into the demons, all the way through to Kibutsuji himself as Yoriichi spoke the last 5 words that would put an end to all the running and all the hiding. How could you ever forget? Akaza leaped back from Yoriichi and stared at him. The expression on his face was a twisting mess of horror, terror, and disbelief. When the demon spoke, it wasn't the low melodic tones of his earlier speech that came out. It was the voice Yoriichi remembered all too well from his memories and nightmares. Yoriichi Tsugikuni, Kibutsuji said, using Akaza's mouth. I am back, Kibutsuji, Yoriichi said. I am going to put an end to all of this. You are not going to take Kyajuro tonight or any other night. Now that I am here, you won't take anyone else either. I intend to get back everyone you stole, and when that is done, I am coming for you. And this time, you won't be able to break into pieces small enough to escape. Kibutsuji hissed and Akaza's body took a step back. You couldn't do it before and I was far weaker then. I have become stronger in the centuries you have been away. So much stronger. I will crush you like the pest you are. Kibutsuji's tone was angry and confident, but there was the slightest tremor to it. When Yoriichi took a step closer, Akaza's body flinched and took another step back. It doesn't matter how much stronger you have become, Yoriichi said. I am still going to defeat you. For Michikatsu's sake and for the sake of everyone whose lives you have taken. Have your pawn run away now, or he is the first one I will start with. Tension gathered in the air like the air around a rod before a lightning strike. Yoriichi's sword was one glancing blow away from shattering and his muscles ached with strain. Every bit of discipline Yoriichi had was going to holding himself still. If Kibutsuji saw the slightest hint of weakness, everything would be over. Dawn was minutes away. With Akaza's speed, that was still several minutes too slow. Everything depended on this one moment. This one bluff. Akaza's body took several giant steps back and then the demon turned, fleeing into the forest. Yoriichi watched him disappear and stayed standing in the same position for several minutes until dawn finally stole over the horizon. He dropped his sword, which shattered like glass, then fell to one knee. His lungs heaved, breaths coming in big, noisy gasps. Danitsujiro, Inosuke shouted, running over to him. I'm fine, Yoriichi said. Fine. You are bleeding again, Inosuke protested. Feeling the warm, wet spread, Yoriichi looked down and saw the blood spots on his tunic darkening. With an effort of will and some moments of effort, he managed to seal it closed. Rengoku, is he? Yoriichi began. I am here, Kyajuro's voice said from behind him. Yoriichi tried to stand up and only succeeded in falling to his knees. Let me help you, Inosuke said, putting one of Yoriichi's arms over his shoulders. Stupid idiot. You shouldn't be trying to walk on your own. With Inosuke's help, Yoriichi turned around to see that Kyajuro had fallen onto his knees. The Hashira's breathing was harsh and had a slight hitch to it, but remained even. The marks had faded from Kyajuro's dirty, blood-streaked face. Blood still trickled down from the cut on his temples and one of his eyes was screwed tightly shut. From how his body was hunched in on itself, Yoriichi could tell several ribs had been broken and internal organs bruised. The flame Hashira had to be in pain too extreme for even his impressive will to suppress. He still managed to smile as Inosuke helped Yoriichi over to him. You did well. Far better than even I had imagined. To stand up against upper 3 on your own took courage and skill unlike any I have experienced before, Kyajuro said. Yoriichi didn't know what to say, so he accepted the compliment with a small nod. There are still civilians in need of help. I managed to keep anyone from dying, but we still have lots of injured and frightened people. Normally, I would be there to reassure them and take charge. In my current condition, I am ashamed to say I can't really move. You are not much better, young Kamado. Inosuke, it falls to you and the boy of yellow to see the civilians. The Kikushi should be here soon. In the meantime, keep everyone calm and take care of whatever injuries can't wait, Kyajuro said. Inosuke grinned and let go of Yoriichi, flexing his muscles. You got it, bug eyes, Inosuke said. Leave it to the great Lord Inosuke. I'll have these weaklings worshipping me as their god in no time. Yoriichi slipped from Inosuke's shoulders and fell to the ground. The other boy didn't seem to notice. He charged off in the direction of the wrecked train and the civilians milling about in confusion and panic. Yoriichi had landed facing Kyajuro. The Hashira looked him over, ever-present smile still fixed on his face. Are you going to ask me about it? About what happened with Akaza? Yoriichi asked. I am curious, Kyajuro admitted. The way that demon reacted and the name he called you by. I have never heard of something like this happening before and I am sure the master will want to know. But we are both injured and there will be time for that later. When we are rested and all the civilians are taken care of. They heard the sound of shouting carrying over the morning breeze and winced. The Kokushi had better come quickly or they would be arriving to an injured and irate group of civilians. 2 encounters with upper ranks within months of each other. Most Hashira don't even encounter one. Tell me, Tanjiro. Are you simply that lucky or that unlucky? Shinobu asked. From his position, lying on a hospital bed in the butterfly mansion and looking up into the insect Hashira's deceptively cheerful face, Yoriichi felt unlucky was the right word. When they arrived on the scene, the Kokushi had wasted no time in getting both Kyajuro and Yoriichi onto stretchers. Yoriichi could have sworn the Kokushi had run all the way to where they got the stretchers from and back. 1 or 2 of them certainly were panting like they had. Kyajuro objected to getting onto his stretcher, assuring the Kokushi that he could get himself to the butterfly mansion and that they should focus on the civilians. There are already plenty of medics attending to the train's passengers, a male Kokushi said. We knew the incident would have a large civilian casualty count, so a large group of us came. Our presence will not be missed. The civilians should still come first. Even if it is only 4 of you, 4 could make a difference, Kyajuro argued. You listen to me, the male Kokushi began to snap, then another, smaller Kokushi put a hand on his shoulder and stepped in front of him. We will let you walk if you want. All you have to do is walk past us and we will leave you alone, the female Kokushi said sweetly. Thank you. Kyajuro said. He started to stand up and then fell back to his knees. A second, much slower try and he managed to get to his feet, legs shaking and body curled up around his stomach. As he took a step forward, most of the Kokushi watched with wide eyes. The female Kokushi simply stood and waited. Kyajuro put his weight on one leg and landed on his knees again, chest heaving, face white with pain. This time, Kyajuro didn't try to get back up. He sighed and allowed the female Kokushi to help him onto the stretcher. Yoriichi didn't object to his stretcher. His entire body was aching in a slow pulse of pain and his limbs felt like they had been swapped for lead duplicates. Now that he was relatively safe, the sharp pain of his stab wound was making itself felt with every intake of breath. After a quick stop for one of the Kokushi to grab Nezuko's box, much to Yoriichi's relief, they had set off for the butterfly mansion. Once there, Kyajuro was hurried off to a different room while Aoi ran frantically to grab Shinobu and Yoriichi was taken to a bed to rest and wait. He'd fallen asleep then and now just awoken to see Shinobu standing over him. Rengoku, Yoriichi asked. Is he? Shinobu laughed. Rengoku is fine. We managed to stitch up the major injuries and have him hooked up to some blood and something for the pain. It will take more than this to put Kyajuro Rengoku down for good. Her smile faded and her expression turned serious. One of his eyes is crushed and I doubt he will ever be able to see out of it again. From what I can tell, several of his internal organs are bruised. He has several nasty breaks and suffered major blood loss. If the fight hadn't ended when it did. If he'd suffered more injury, I am not sure he would still be here. Yoriichi nodded and tried to fight back the feelings of guilt. He should have stepped in sooner. He should have told Kyajuro the truth. He should have. A small sharp pulse of pain on his forehead interrupted his train of thought. He looked up to see Shinobu pulling her hand back, finger still out from the flick she had just given him. "None of this is your fault," Shinobu said. "Kyajuro Rengoku is a Hashira. It is his duty to protect his comrades from overwhelming threats like upper ranks. You couldn't have stopped this from happening." Yoriichi blinked at her and she smiled. "I am curious to know why the upper rank ran in the end, though. Now that I have seen Rengoku's injuries, I can tell the demon was on the edge of winning. What would make him give that up?" The terrified expression on Akaza's face just before he turned and bolted away flashed into Yoriichi's mind. Yoriichi didn't want to lie to Shinobu. He didn't want to explain the truth to her at that moment either, so he stayed silent. "I suppose we can get to that later," Shinobu said, after a moment. "For now, let's get you taken care of." Muzan sat in his wooden chair in his office in the Infinity Castle. Shattered glass littered the floor, wet spots of various colors from the liquids in his beaker dotting the ground in erratic swirls. Pages growing dark from spilled ink and other liquids lay scattered on the floor. His desk had almost caved inwards from a large crack in its center. In the midst of the destruction, Muzan sat, eyes blazing at the floor and chest heaving. He was alive. Yoriichi Tsugikuni was alive. Somehow, he had come back. Muzan had been in his child form, reading a new book on wild plants and their medicinal properties when Akaza made contact with the Hashira. He'd checked in on the fight occasionally, losing interest as Akaza toyed with his prey. There was no point in watching. Akaza clearly outclassed the Hashira in every way. Then Akaza had spotted the marks and Muzan stopped reading for a moment to pay a bit more attention. So this was the man who defeated Jutaro. An impressive feat to be sure. Even if Daki was the real reason why Jutaro lost. The fight became more intense after that and Muzan wondered for a moment if Akaza would defeat the Hashira. Only a moment, though. The man clearly didn't have a grasp on his powers yet. Raw strength and speed had been enough to kill the weakest of his upper moons. It wouldn't be enough to defeat Akaza. Turning his attention back to his book, Muzan began to read once more. He'd barely turned the page when a single sentence cut through his concentration like a white-hot blade. Such disregard for human life. What is so amusing about this? The words made him freeze and drop the book he was holding. Closing his eyes, Muzan focused on his link to Akaza and saw the boy with Hanafuda earrings from before. He was pushing back against Akaza, keeping the demon from reaching the Hashira. His scar had grown darker and bigger. So much like his mark. Had Muzan imagined those words just because the boy resembled him? The next words struck like a physical blow. So tell me then. What exactly is the weight of a human life to you? Muzan hissed and tightened his connection to Akaza. Once might have been an accident, but twice could only be deliberate. Somehow this boy, this child knew the exact words. The words that had come from his mouth on that day. He could see it clearly in his mind again, exactly as he did in his infrequent nightmares. Yoriichi Tsugikuni advancing on him with eyes full of a powerful, cold wrath. Like what Muzan imagined the eyes of angry God might look like, should any of them actually exist. The fear he'd felt for the first time in centuries as he ran away in as many directions as he could, only for most of him to be cut through by that searing crimson sword. It couldn't be true. Yoriichi Tsugikuni died centuries ago and reincarnation had never been proven to be real. As if he could hear those thoughts, the boy looked straight into Akaza's eyes and through his eyes, Muzan's. Then he spoke, "How could you ever forget?" Muzan had instinctively reached into Akaza and began to speak through him. He'd tried to sound confident, to convince himself and Yoriichi that Yoriichi's presence changed nothing. Then Yoriichi had leveled his threat and Muzan made Akaza run. Muzan felt upper three's surprise and shock as he plunged into the forest and kept running. Akaza had never run from an opponent before. Not even when upper one had him on his knees, vomiting up his insides. Now he was running away from a human, a boy with barely any fighting spirit. Shame and resentment mixed in Akaza's mind until Muzan sent a sharp pain through it that made Akaza stumble. Keep going for another 2 hours and then you may stop and wait for night or continue on more slowly, Muzan told him. He then stepped back, relinquishing control of Akaza's body back to the demon. My lord, Akaza began and then doubled over as Muzan lashed out at him. You have already failed me, Akaza. You are lucky I am not ripping your body apart with agony right now. Do not presume to question me as well. Akaza bowed his head. Muzan withdrew entirely before Akaza finished apologizing. He'd stood there in the room, the book on the floor by his feet and a cold sweat running down his forehead. Escaping out the window, he'd called out to Neikime and vanished into the Infinity Castle. Once he'd locked himself in his office there, Muzan felt the terror recede and rage began to fill him. It wasn't fair. Yoriichi Tsugikuni should never have existed in the first place. No human should ever have such power. When he died, Muzan had thought the world had been corrected. Without Yoriichi in it, demons would once again rule it and nothing would ever threaten Muzan again. Now that was all over. The universe had been bent out of shape again and that unnatural, freakish man had returned. Muzan's hands had clenched and unclenched, veins pulsing on his forehead. He screamed and swept the beakers from his desk, shattering them all on the floor. He'd rampaged through his office in a fury, leaving the current mess on the floor. With as much calm as he could muster, Muzan ordered Neikime to locate Upper One and bring him to Muzan. He sat on the chair in his office, waiting. A knock sounded on the door. My lord, Upper One said, his deep, resonant voice seeping through the door. May I come in? Muzan slid the door open and grabbed handfuls of Kokushibo's purple and black kimono. He pulled the other demon into the room, so fast Upper One stumbled. Before Kokushibo could speak, Muzan hurled himself into Kokushibo's mind. He surged through Kokushibo's memories like a cloud of locusts, roughly searching each one in minute detail before moving on to the next. Any thought, any idea, any hint that Kokushibo knew his twin had returned and Muzan would destroy him piece by piece. When the first search found nothing, Muzan calmed slightly. He performed a second, more painstaking search and then a third. Kokushibo stood there as Muzan searched. He had to be in agony from what Muzan was doing. Muzan was not trying to be gentle as he tore Kokushibo's mind apart, but he refused to so much as tremble. Finally, Muzan let go of Kokushibo and stood back. Turn into your human disguise, he ordered. All 6 of Kokushibo's eyes blinked. Muzan had never made such a request before. While Muzan had never put the order into words, it was understood between them that Kokushibo was never to appear before his lord in human disguise, not even to avoid attracting attention if they were among humans. Still, Kokushibo didn't question his lord's orders. The top and bottom-most pairs of eyes closed then receded back into his head, the skin closing over them like they had never existed. The kanji marking his eyes disappeared and the colors faded until he had dark red irises with normal white sclera. He looked almost exactly like Yoriichi had when Muzan met him all those centuries ago. The sight drew all the terror, fear, and rage of the last few hours out, leaving Muzan shaking. His fingers elongated into claws and he launched himself at Kokushibo with a scream. Claws dug deep into pale skin, blood flying from them as they tore free from flesh to be driven back in again and again. Kokushibo's chest became a bloody, meaty mess. His face began to disappear, covered up by gore and savagely beaten out of shape. Throughout the entire assault, Kokushibo didn't so much as twitch. He didn't try to speak, to demand why he deserved such punishment. He remained above all as Muzan's loyal servant. At last, Muzan stepped back and allowed himself a few deep breaths. There were no signs that Kokushibo had broken free. Not in the demon's mind or in his actions. As long as that was true, Muzan still had something over Yoriichi Tsugikuni. Kokushibo was tangible proof that Muzan had still won. A niggling part of his mind reminded him of Yoriichi's threats. The promise that everything he had fought so hard for over these centuries would be torn down. Muzan pushed it aside. "Heal yourself and return to your demon form," Muzan said. Kokushibo bowed his head. The bloody tears in his skin, the parts of his body that were currently more meat than anything, and the fractures in his face all vanished. The only proof they had ever been were the rips in Kokushibo's clothes and the scattered pools and drips of blood littering the floor. "What do you wish me to do, my lord?" Kokushibo asked. "There was an encounter between Upper 3 and a Hashira last night. It did not go as expected," Muzan said. "Shall I punish Akaza for his failure?" Kokushibo asked, his hand drifting to his sword. "No. I shall see to that myself," Muzan said. "I want you to tell Neikime to summon all the upper moons into the Infinity Castle tonight." Stretching his senses out, Muzan could feel Kokushibo was curious. The upper moons met less than once a century and now they were going to have another meeting in the same year as the last. Upper One kept his mouth shut, but Muzan could see the questions in his servant's mind. They would have to wait until tonight. Now that Yoriichi thought about, he was lucky it was Kaneo who found him instead of Shinobu or Aoi. He sat on the floor in one of the hallways with his back pressed against the wall, breathing hard and looking up into Kaneo's wide, confused eyes. "What are you doing?" Kaneo asked. Yoriichi shifted slightly and winced. He'd accidentally pulled on his sticks and now his abused side was throbbing. "I need to see Rengoku," Yoriichi said. It had been a week since he'd woken up in the Butterfly Mansion. He hadn't seen Shinobu since that first day and the only updates on Kyajuro he could get out of Aoi were that the Hashira was alive and in expert hands. Focus on yourself for once, idiot. He needed to see Kyajuro. To see for himself that his friend was alive and that Akaza hadn't broken him for good. So he'd pushed himself up from his bed and used the wall to support himself as he walked. His biggest problem hadn't turned out to be his weak legs or still healing sticks. It was that he didn't know what room Kyajuro was in. He'd already searched most of a wing of the Butterfly Mansion and still hadn't found him. Then his legs had given out entirely and now he was stuck on the floor, facing Kaneo. If it were Shinobu, he'd have been taken back to bed, threatened with needles, sedatives, and everything an angry doctor can do to a patient, and then forced to stay. Aoi would have dragged him back to bed while chewing him out. Sumi, Neo, or Kyo would have run off to tell Shinobu or Aoi. Lucky for Yoriichi, he'd been found by Kaneo. She blinked at him and then asked, "Do you need help?" Yoriichi nodded and she carefully helped him up from the floor, throwing one of his arms across her shoulders and supporting his weight with her own body. "I don't know where he is," Yoriichi admitted as they started walking. "I was here when they first brought you two in," Kaneo said. "I helped." Shinobu needed everyone who could to help. His condition was bad. Yoriichi's heart sank. Neither of them spoke as Kaneo carefully navigated through the hallways until she reached a room with a large, worn-looking wooden door. Carefully, she pushed it open and helped Yoriichi into the room. The room was so bright, it took a minute for Yoriichi's eyes to adjust. The light in the room came from a large window set into the wall where the sunlight came pouring in. Two trees trailed wisteria blossoms partway across the window and around the edges. The peaceful garden outside the window lent the room an air of tranquility. Kyajuro lay on the large bed in the center of the room. One eye was closed while the other was covered in clean white bandages that encircled his forehead and part of his face. One bandaged arm lay atop the covers, connected to an foredrip in the corner. The Hashira seemed so still and small laying in that bed, nothing like the loud, vibrant man Yoriichi had come to call friend. Yoriichi watched for a moment as Kyajuro's chest rose and fell in a gentle, but consistent rhythm. Opening his eyes in the transparent world, Yoriichi saw that Kyajuro's heart beat steadily and his lungs continue to fill with air and then flatten out as they expelled it. Nothing wrong with Kyajuro's breathing, but Yoriichi could see cracks in his ribs on one side. He didn't dare look up at Kyajuro's face to see what his ruined eye looked like. He hasn't woken up yet, a voice said. Blinking, Yoriichi looked over to see someone who looked like a smaller version of Kyajuro at first glance sitting next to the bed. The longer Yoriichi looked, though, the more differences he saw. The boy's hair was different for one thing, pulled back mostly into a ponytail. The eyes were the same color as Kyajuro's yet with a more liquid, nervous quality to them. The boy's head was down slightly and his shoulders tense. He lacked the confidence Kyajuro always held himself with. "Oh, you are injured," the boy said, hastily standing up from his chair. "Here. You can sit down." "Thank you, but," Yoriichi began to say. Kaneo cut him off by maneuvering him over the chair and setting him down in it. She gave him a firm look that told him she wouldn't be helping him if he tried to stand up and give the chair back. Yoriichi met the boy's gaze and tried to think of something to say. Should he ask who the boy was? Maybe offer his own name? The boy stammered nervously. He shifted slightly and Yoriichi realized he was probably staring. Awkwardly. "My name is Sanjuro Rengoku." "It's nice to meet you," he said quickly, bowing. "You are his brother," Yoriichi said. Sanjuro nodded. "You are Tanjiro Komado, right?" "My brother's Tsuguko." "He's told me a lot about you," Sanjuro said. He blinked and then waved his hands. "All good things, I promise," he said. Unsure what else to do, Yoriichi nodded. He looked over at Kyajuro and tried to think of what to say. Kyajuro's life didn't seem to be in danger, yet he was badly injured. Sanjuro had to feel upset about his brother's injuries. Yoriichi should probably say something to comfort him. What to say, though? Why was it so difficult to come up with something? "You were with him, right? When the train crashed and he fought that upper-rank demon?" Sanjuro asked. Warily, Yoriichi nodded. He braced himself for the accusations, for the questions about why Kyajuro had to get so badly hurt, why Yoriichi hadn't done more. Sanjuro bowed deeply to Yoriichi, who stared blankly at him in shock. "Thank you so much for protecting him. For making sure he came back alive." "I don't know what I would do if he died," Sanjuro said. His voice quavered slightly and tears rolled down his cheeks. "I didn't," Yoriichi started. "It was all him. Your brother is the reason no one died. He fought the demon until it was nearly dawn. I just came along at the end." Sanjuro smiled and wiped at his tears. "I'm sure you did more than you thought you did. Kyajuro is always telling me that working together is the biggest advantage demon slayers have over demons. Whatever you did, it was enough for him to make it back. I'm grateful for that." Yoriichi hesitated, unsure what to say to that. Later he would blame his preoccupation for not noticing that someone had come into the room and stood directly behind him. The first clue he got was a sudden grip on his shoulder that clamped down like iron talons. Jerking his head up, Yoriichi saw Shinobu standing over him with an overly bright smile on her face and a vein throbbing in one of her temples. Somehow, her small body was radiating enough malice to nearly fill the entire room. "Tanjiro," Shinobu said. Just from the tone, Yoriichi knew he was in trouble. She only used the saccharine, overly sweet tone when she was at the end of her patience and moments away from inflicting mayhem on someone. Last time he'd heard it, Inosuke had popped his stitches for the third time in a day. Shinobu had called Inosuke into her exam room in that sweet tone, and when Inosuke had emerged, he'd been more terrified than Yoriichi had ever seen him. To that day, Inosuke refused to discuss what happened and never disobeyed the insect Hashira ever again. "Did you walk all the way to this room alone?" "No, Kaneo." Yoriichi turned to point to the girl and found that she disappeared at some point while Yoriichi was talking to Sanjuro. Whether she'd left the two alone for privacy or had sensed an irate Shinobu on the warpath then made her escape was unknown. And after I told you to rest and that Kyajuro wasn't allowed any visitors yet? Shinobu asked. Her fingers dug deeper into Yoriichi's shoulder and he barely suppressed a wince. It's okay, Tanjiro said. He isn't causing any problems. Shinobu turned her smile on him and he took an involuntary step back. Opening her eyes, she toned her aura down slightly. There was something about Tanjiro that made scaring him feel so wrong. Iguro's remarks were less cutting and even Sanemi cursed less in front of the younger Rengoku. She wasn't immune to whatever it was. I'm as worried for Tanjiro's health as I am for your brother's. He went through a major battle too after all, Shinobu said, and then she turned back to Yoriichi, her aura cranked right back up again. I think it's best I get Tanjiro back to his room. We need to have a discussion about a doctor's orders. Slumping slightly, Yoriichi closed his eyes. These next few hours were not going to be fun. By the end of that week, Shinobu was more irritated than that time Tomioka nearly had one of his arms chopped off and she had to chase after him for a week to give him proper medical attention. The cause of her irritation was not Tanjiro, who had been the model of behavior after her scolding. The problem was her fellow Hashira. It started with Iguro somehow slithering his way into Kyajuro's room. With him was Mitsuri, who leaped atop Kyajuro and then proceeded to nearly bury him in snacks and sweet potatoes. Next, Yuzui leaped in through Kyajuro's window while Shinobu was changing the flame Hashira's bandages. He didn't have the decency to look ashamed when Shinobu lit into him for disturbing Kyajuro. He's passed out, Yuzui said. Not like he's going to care. Gyomii appeared in the middle of the night, tears spilling down his face as he prayed for Kyajuro's health. How such a large man could sneak so far into the butterfly mansion without being seen was a mystery. Muchiro was found wandering the halls outside of Kyajuro's room. He was harder to be mad at since he was the youngest and absent-minded. Shinobu had sighed and gently guided him out the gates of the butterfly mansion. By the time Shinugazawa was barging into the butterfly mansion, loudly demanding to see Kyajuro, Shinobu was nearly frustrated enough to draw her sword and threaten to infect him with the nastiest poison she had available. Surprisingly, the least annoying visitor was Tomioka. He'd knocked politely at the gate. When she answered, he'd been looking at the ground, the expression on his face somewhat lost. Can I see him? Tomioka asked. Maybe it was because he was the only one to actually ask, maybe it was because seeing him look so pathetic was out of character. In the end, Shinobu had let him into the butterfly mansion then, briefly, taken him to see Kyajuro. Tomioka stood at the end of the bed, looking uncertain as he took in Kyajuro. He didn't say a word, but Shinobu thought she saw something in his face relax. Gently, she guided him out into the hall and Tomioka didn't fight her. Thank you, he said. Shinobu nodded. Would you like to see Tanjiro as well, she asked. Tomioka blinked, hesitated, and then gave an uncertain nod. Taking a hold of his wrist, she tugged him along behind her until they reached the room where Tanjiro was currently sitting with Nezuko. It was a small room with no windows so Nezuko didn't have to worry about the sun. At the sight of Tomioka, Nezuko, who was currently in her child form, beamed and raced up to him. She hugged him, her head just barely coming up to his waist. Tomioka gazed down at her, eyes wide and a shocked expression on his face. He froze with both arms slightly in the air. Nezuko stared up at him. She grunted and tilted her head at him. He looked confused and she stamped a tiny foot in frustration. She wants you to pat her on the head, Tanjiro said, from his seat on the floor. Slowly, as if he was afraid Nezuko might bite, Tomioka put one hand on Nezuko's head and gently patted it. She beamed and hugged him a bit tighter before taking his wrist and tugging. Tomioka let her lead him over to Tanjiro. The next few minutes were funniest Shinobu had experienced in years. Tomioka and Tanjiro made stilted small talk while Nezuko flitted happily between them. Both of their faces remained blank, but the look in their eyes said both of them were seriously uncomfortable talking. If I can manage a bit of spare time, Shinobu thought. I really should look into Tomioka's family tree more. Tanjiro's too old to be Tomioka's secret love child, but a forgotten half-brother isn't out of the question. It was some days after Tomioka's visit when Aoi came into Yoriichi's room and informed him that Kyajuro was awake and wanted to see him. After you talk to him, head to rehabilitation training, Aoi said. Shinobu informed me that you are ready to begin it. Yoriichi politely thanked her and made his way through the butterfly mansion to Kyajuro's room. He was walking far more steadily than he had on his first ill-advised trip and didn't have to use the wall to support himself. Young Komado, I trust your injuries are healing well, Kyajuro said. Yoriichi nodded and shut the door behind him. Good, Kyajuro said. Please come sit. Kyajuro indicated the chair by the bed and Yoriichi obediently seated himself on it. Kyajuro himself was sitting up slightly, propped up by pillows. How is do you know when, Yoriichi stuttered. My injuries are healing fine, Kyajuro said, a smile on his face. While I'm told they are quite severe and that it shall take several months before I am in top form again, I will be able to continue as a Hashira. That is enough. But your eye, Yoriichi pointed out. One of Kyajuro's hand slowly rose to the bandages around his ruined eye. I do not deny that it will be tough. Having only one eye will make perceiving depth and distance correctly hard. If I train my hardest, though, I am sure I will adjust, he said. Yoriichi looked down at the floor. Kyajuro shouldn't have to adjust to losing an eye. He shouldn't be in that hospital bed at all. If Yoriichi had found a way to defeat or chase off Upper 3 sooner, then. None of this is your fault, Kyajuro said. Looking up, Yoriichi met Kyajuro's one remaining eye. It seemed to shine with a kind of soft light to it. As a demon slayer, it is our duty to protect the people around us. You and I did our duty to the best of our abilities that night. Thanks to us, the boar, the boy of yellow, and your sister, not one life was lost. Our duty was fulfilled and that is more than enough for me. Yoriichi thought back to all the people he had seen on the train. To the mother trying to hurt her 2 rambunctious boys and the businessman in a cheap brown Western-style suit and hat reading a newspaper and grumbling to himself about the noise. He'd focused so much on the blood and pain of that night, that he'd forgotten what they had done it for. As soon as I was well enough to do so, I sent a report of what happened on and around the Mugen train to the master, Kyajuro said. What happened was exceptional, especially the encounter with Upper Moon 3. Last night, I received a message summoning the 2 of us to the master's side later this evening. Yoriichi had been expecting this meeting, had been dreading it all along. When he revealed his identity that night, he'd know he was revealing it to more than just Kibutsuji. Word would reach the master and then Yoriichi would have to deal with the consequences. I understand, Yoriichi said. Will you be well enough to travel, though? Kyajuro waved a hand. The Kikushi will help move me. Master wants to speak with both of us. Coming to the butterfly mansion could compromise his safety and health. It is better that we come to him than he try to come to us. They spoke for a little bit longer about other topics like Inosuke and Zenitsu. Since neither demon slayer had been injured badly during the Mugen train incident, they were already being sent out on solo missions. Zenitsu still wept when he got the news, but at least attempted to screw up his courage. Pray for me, Nezuko, he said once and then ran out the gate of the butterfly mansion, tears still streaming from his face. By contrast, Inosuke seemed eager for every mission that came his way. They'd better be stronger than last time, Inosuke said. I barely broke a sweat on that last one. How am I supposed to train to fight the bigger ones when the ones they send me after are so weak? I'm glad to hear they are doing so well, Kyajuro said. Perhaps we can train with them when you are healed up enough. Then Sumi poked her head in the door and informed Yoriichi that he'd better hurry or he'd be late for rehabilitation training and then Aoi would get all mad again. Seeing Master Ubuyashiki again was sobering for Yoriichi. The purplish rot now covered his face, reaching down his neck and beneath his clothes. His breaths were ragged and he let out the occasional wheeze. He sat stiffly on his bed, the rest of his body covered by a blanket. There was an ethereal, wavering quality to his presence, like it was threatening to blow away like smoke. The inner workings the transparent world revealed were worse than his outward appearance. The rot was inside Ubuyashiki now, reaching down towards his lungs and his heart. If he had a year left in him, Yoriichi would be pleasantly surprised. Sitting next to Master Ubuyashiki was a woman with long white hair and tender, plum-colored eyes. She glanced at Yoriichi and Kyajuro as they arrived, but did not take her eyes off Master Ubuyashiki. "Welcome Kyajuro, Tanjiro. You have my gratitude for what you did in the Mugen train incident. Thanks to you, there was not a single fatality. An impressive feat when 2 members of the 12 Kazuki, one an upper rank no less, are involved. I am glad to see you both made it out alive as well. Tell me, how are your injuries?" Master Ubuyashiki asked. "They are healing, Master," Kyajuro said. "Thanks to Shinobu Kocho's excellent care, we shall be able to resume our duties." The flame Hashira's voice was loud, but sounded a bit subdued. His single remaining eye remained fixed on Master Ubuyashiki, taking in his poor condition. It was hard to keep up his usual cheer at such a visceral reminder of how little time the master had left. Soon the disease would take him and the world would lose a great, gentle man. "I'm glad to hear it," Master Ubuyashiki said, smiling. "I know you both sent written reports on the Mugen train incident and I have had them read to me more than once. I would still like to hear about it directly from you." Kyajuro bowed his head. "Of course, Master," he said. Neither of them discussed who would take what part, but they both took turns. Kyajuro took the first part, explaining the slasher incident and relating everything up to the part where everyone was put to sleep. Yoriichi then took over, recounting his own experiences in the dream world, the fight with Lower One, and the train crash. At that point, Kyajuro took charge again and detailed the aftermath of the crash along with his fight with Akaza. Finally, Yoriichi repeated his own short fight and conversation with Akaza. "Yoriichi Tsugikuni," Master Ubuyashiki said. "You are him, aren't you? You were reborn." "Yes," Yoriichi said. "I do not know how or why, but I was given a second chance. I don't intend to waste it." Master Ubuyashiki coughed, his body spasming with the motion. The white-haired woman hovered over him, concern on her face. He took a couple deep breaths and waved her off. "I think that it is fate that you should be here," Master Ubuyashiki said. "You have given me the chance to fulfill a promise made by the Ubuyashiki family that I never thought to fulfill." Yoriichi frowned and looked at Master Ubuyashiki in confusion. "Amain, the letter if you please," Master Ubuyashiki said. The white-haired woman nodded and reached into her kimono. She pulled out a small roll of yellowed parchment. When she passed it to Yoriichi, the parchment felt brittle and delicate in his hands. He realized that the letter was old, maybe even ancient. "My long-ago predecessor tried to get this to you, but not even Kasugai crows could locate you after you left the Demon Slayer Corps. He gave up the search eventually, but was convinced that you would make your way back to the Corps somehow. He extracted a promise out of his immediate successor that he would keep the letter and pass it on to you. That promise was made by every master of the Demon Slayer Corps since. Today, I fulfill that promise," Master Ubuyashiki said. Slowly, Yoriichi undid the ragged ribbon tied around the letter and then unrolled it. The letters on the parchment were faded, almost beyond the point of legibility, but he could read them. "Yoriichi Tsugikuni. What the Demon Slayer Corps has done to you is unforgivable. You have always been a loyal member of the Corps and supported it in victory and defeat. In your own time of need, however, we turned our backs on you and cast you out. We should never have blamed you for not defeating Kibutsuji or exiled you for your brother's actions. If I had the strength, I would have kept it from happening. But I was weak and the Hashira would have rebelled if I hadn't punished you. I know that isn't any excuse. I hope you will still accept my apology and lend the Demon Slayer Corps your support once again. We need your skills and your bravery if we are to defeat Kibutsuji. I know that now. Please, lend us your sword once more. Kagari Abuyashiki. Yoriichi stared at the parchment, his hands shaking slightly. Kagaya, Amain cried out. Looking up from the parchment, Yoriichi could see that Master Abuyashiki was bending over. At first, he thought the man was having another attack, then he realized that crippled and sick as he was, the man was trying to bow. I know I have no right to ask this of you. The Demon Slayer Corps and the Abuyashiki family have wronged you horribly. But I must still request it. Will you continue to fight for the Demon Slayer Corps? Will you help us bring down Kibutsuji? Master Abuyashiki asked. I never held a grudge for what happened, Yoriichi said slowly. I won't deny that it hurt, but I never did. Those actions were done in fear and panic. I have my own reasons for wanting Kibutsuji dead, both for what has happened in this life and in the last. Know this. I could never let Kibutsuji get away with what he has done. With toying with human lives like playthings or discarding them like trash. I made a promise to destroy him and return what was lost, and I intend to see it through. Master Abuyashiki slowly sat up and then slouched back slightly, his physical exhaustion and relief plain. Thank you, he said. Silence fell for a moment and Yoriichi became aware of Kyajuro, watching the whole scene with a wide, uncertain eye. There is something I have been meaning to ask, Master Abuyashiki said. Your word choice during the fight with Upper 3. The way you kept saying, take, instead of kill, was that intentional? Yoriichi nodded. It was. Upper 3 originally started the fight intending to kill Rengoku. Based on its actions and words, I think it wanted to have some fun with it, but that was its first goal. Then it saw something, a mark that I believe was placed on Rengoku when Upper 6 was killed. From that point on, its intentions were different. Instead of killing him, it wanted to capture him. Kyajuro frowned and looked confused. Capture? I've never heard of a demon doing such a thing before. How do you know that was what he wanted? Kyajuro asked. Instead of answering, Yoriichi met Master Abuyashiki's blind eyes. Do you know about what happened to my brother, Michikatsu? He asked. Master Abuyashiki nodded. The Abuyashiki family has a detailed record of all significant happenings in the Demon Slayer Corps since it was first founded. Since our family members are unfortunately short-lived, it is the main way we kept to our goals and ensure a smooth transition from generation to generation. That is how I know about you and what happened at your trial. Michikatsu's defection is recorded there as well. While it was never confirmed, the theory is that Michikatsu met Kibutsuji and was persuaded by promises of power and eternal life to betray the Demon Slayer Corps. When he betrayed us, the current master of the Demon Slayer Corps at the time was killed and the Corps thrown into disarray for a time. Yoriichi's eyes left Master Abuyashiki and became distant as if seeing something far away in the past. I never truly believed that Michikatsu had betrayed us. He was ambitious at times, but never that power-hungry. So after the Demon Slayer Corps exiled me, I wandered around looking for him, hoping that I could rescue him or at least get some kind of explanation. A couple years into my wandering, I ran into my first Upper Moon. At first, I didn't recognize him. The transformation to a demon had reshaped his face, making it almost bug-like and given him razor-sharp wings. Just as I was about to cut off its head, though, I realized that I knew it. It was the Thunder Hashira of the Demon Slayer Corps when it was human. The horror of that realization echoed in Yoriichi's mind. The pain he'd felt as he realized that one of his comrades had been turned into a monster. During the fight, its eyes suddenly changed and I felt a powerful, unmistakable presence around me, Muzan Kibutsuji's. The demon's voice changed and Kibutsuji began to speak to me, Yoriichi said. How? Kyajuro exclaimed. Was Kibutsuji nearby somewhere? I don't think so. Since all demons originate from him, I think he has some ability to see through their eyes and to control them, Yoriichi replied. This time, Kibutsuji used his power to taunt me. He wanted me to know that Michikatsu hadn't betrayed me of his own free will. That I failed to protect my own brother. Yoriichi's voice faltered. He could still hear Kibutsuji's voice hissing in his mind. It took him 3 days to transform. During the first one, he lay there and resisted, quiet despite the tremendous pain he had to be in. You would have been proud. By the end of the second, his voice was gone from all the screaming. On the third, he was too weak to do more than cry. He said one single word before my cells overwhelmed him and I took control of his mind. Do you want to know what it was? It was your name. He had held on to hope until the last moment that you would appear and save him. He had such faith in you. The demon smiled, an ugly twisted thing, even without the boar-like tusk sticking out from its mouth. He doesn't remember any of that now, of course. I reached into his mind and found that jealousy he was always harboring. It was never stronger than his love for you, but it was quite substantial. I nurtured it, twisted it, and shaped it until all his memories were seen through it. He hates you now, you know. Even more than I do. Then he told me that he was grateful to me, Yoriichi said. That my brother had been the one to show him the way. The way he could grow stronger throughout the centuries and weaken the demon slayer core at the same time. Master Abuyashiki nodded. You are referring to the idea to form the 12 Kizuki, aren't you? I suspected that they were formed after Michikatsu turned out to be successful, he said. Yes and no, Yoriichi replied. My brother's strength as a demon did give Kibutsuji the idea to form the 12 Kizuki. It also showed Kibutsuji that stronger humans became stronger demons when turned. To keep ahead of the demon slayer core, Kibutsuji needed to turn the strongest humans into 12 Kizuki. My brother's turning also inspired Kibutsuji's method for determining who was the strongest. Do you know what rank my brother had before he was turned? Hashira, Master Abuyashiki replied. He was the moon Hashira and you were the sun Hashira. I don't see what this has to do with Kibutsuji's selection methods. Kibutsuji likely learned about our ranking structure through Michikatsu's memories. He learned that the Hashira are the strongest demon slayers, Yoriichi said. Kibutsuji already had success turning one Hashira into a weapon against it. He decided to do the same with other Hashira. You don't mean, Kyajuro asked slowly, that the 12 Kizuki were all Hashira before being turned? Not the 12 Kizuki, Yoriichi replied. The upper moons. They are the strongest demons in existence for a reason. Kyajuro's single eye was wide with horror and his expressive face was nearly slack with it. He shook his head. So Kibutsuji kidnaps any Hashira he comes across and turns them into demons? Why are there only 6 upper-rank demons then? Not any Hashira, Yoriichi said. His criteria is more specific. Since his upper moons always needed to be growing in strength, he needed to find any human stronger than any of his upper moons and turn them quickly. The way he discovered this was pitting his upper moons against our Hashira. If the Hashira died, the demon slayer core lost a valuable soldier and he knew his upper moons were still the strongest they could be. The Hashira who won, though, they had proven themselves to be stronger than an upper moon and could not be allowed to continue existing. Why not just kill them then? Kyajuro demanded. If all he wanted was for the threats to be gone. Because Kibutsuji is clever, Master Abuyashiki said. Killing any Hashira who slay upper moons takes our strength from us. Taking those Hashira and turning them into demons strengthens the upper moons while weakening us at the same time. His blank eyes turned to the floor and he looked troubled. How did we never notice this before, he wondered aloud. Because upper moons are hard to defeat, Yoriichi said. It has been over a century since the last upper moon was slain. The abductions we are talking about are spread over such a vast period of time, that no one would notice the pattern easily. If I didn't have Kibutsuji's taunts and 2 lives worth of experience, I wouldn't have seen it either. Yoriichi bowed to Kyajuro. I am sorry, Yoriichi said. I knew after what happened with Upper 6 that it was possible you would be targeted. I told myself that Kibutsuji wouldn't mark you that way, that we had killed Upper 6 as a group and he wouldn't mark anyone. I ignored all the signs until it was too late. It's my fault you went into this blind. Kyajuro blinked, a startled look on his face. You are not to blame. There was no way for you to know Upper 3 would show up, he said. But even without that chance encounter, it would have happened eventually. My cowardice put you at risk, Yoriichi said. Kyajuro studied Yoriichi for a moment and then a soft smile broke over his face. Young Komado, what you did, standing up to Upper 3 and exposing yourself to Kibutsuji, took courage. If you hadn't done it, I would be dead now, or worse, turned into an upper-rank demon. The one thing I do not think you will ever be is a coward. Yoriichi straightened up, face overcome, for once, by a visible expression of surprise. Master Ubuyashiki coughed, drawing attention back to himself. What you have shared is indeed troubling, Master Ubuyashiki said. But it also provides us with an opportunity. There is a chance we can identify the Hashira these upper ranks used to be. If we can do that, we might get information on their fighting style and powers. I will search the Ubuyashiki family records for any Hashira who went missing or supposedly died after killing an upper-rank demon. We also now know that we can stop Kibutsuji from getting stronger by keeping any of our Hashira who kill an upper rank out of Kibutsuji's hands. If he can't get to those Hashira, he will be forced to fill his upper ranks with weaker demons or leave them unfilled. Forgive me, Master, but I don't see how, Yoriichi said. We either take the Hashira out of regular deployment, in which case we still weaken ourselves, or continue to use them until the upper moons find them again then take them. Master Ubuyashiki smiled. It is quite the conundrum. For now, I think it is best that we send you and Kyajuro somewhere safe to rest and recover from your injuries. The Butterfly Mansion is secure, but, in light of this new information, it might be best to send you someplace even more secure. I heard both of you have suffered damage to your swords. Thinking back to the battered hilt his sword had turned into after the fight with Upper 3 made Yoriichi wince. Why did he have such an issue holding on to blades in his second life? Yes, Master, Kyajuro said. Young Komado's sword shattered and mine lost most of its blade. Then I think a trip to the Swordsmith village would be a good fit. The location is a closely guarded secret and it possesses natural hot springs good for healing. You can leave as soon as it is safe enough for you to travel, Master Ubuyashiki said. That is very kind of you, Master, Kyajuro said. We will leave as soon as we can. We will keep what you know about the upper moons confined to the 4 of us for now, Master Ubuyashiki said. Yoriichi's reincarnation should also be kept a secret. After you have recovered, Kyajuro, I will call a Hashira meeting to discuss both matters and how to move forward. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that. Yoriichi had said most of what he needed to, but the hardest conversation was yet to come. Yoriichi waited until Kyajuro had been placed back into his bed in the Butterfly Mansion, then took a deep breath and spoke. There is one more thing you need to know, Yoriichi said, and then he told Kyajuro about the marks as well as the price they exacted. I see, Kyajuro said. So that is why I suddenly felt so much faster and stronger in those moments. It was a bit too fast and strong for me to handle at the time, but if I train using those marks, then I should be able to draw out my full potential. You have my thanks for telling me this. But you are going to die, Yoriichi said. Everyone with a mark except for me died at age 25 from the strain. The marks remained on the face, so it may be different this time. Still I don't think we can assume you will live past 25. Kyajuro's smile turned slightly sad. Young Komado, do you know how many Hashira live to retire? He asked. Yoriichi shook his head. My father is the only one in decades to do so. The Hashira nearest to him retired after losing a leg. When one sets out to become a Hashira, an early death is something that you have to make peace with, or you will never succeed in becoming one. That doesn't mean I want to die, nor am I glad to hear that my death might be a foregone possibility. It does mean that I won't let it keep me from living my life or taking the joy from it any second more than it has to. It wasn't the reaction Yoriichi had expected. He found it unexpectedly heartening to see Kyajuro smile, sad as it was, and know he hadn't ruined it. I hope you know, young Komado, that I do not intend to rest long, Kyajuro said. Soon I will be back in fighting shape. Even before then, we will work on gathering your strength. The demons will be coming for us both with everything they have. We cannot afford to fall short. As Yoriichi nodded his head in agreement, he felt a sense of relief fill him at last. Like the weight of everything he'd been carrying on his own up until now had lessened. With his secrets disclosed, Yoriichi Tsugikuni finally felt free. Kyajuro led the way down the street. His pace was noticeably slower and he gritted his teeth every few steps, but the strides were long and powerful. He had improved by leaps and bounds in the past few days. Yoriichi himself was now able to move without wincing, albeit slowly and with care. We will depart for the Swordsmith village tomorrow, Kyajuro had explained that morning. Shinobu has cleared both of us for travel. Before we do, there is something I need to show you. He then proceeded to all but push Yoriichi out the door, leaving word with a confused Kaneo that he and Yoriichi would be out for some time. Kaneo had nodded, then shot Yoriichi a worried glance. It'll be okay, Yoriichi told her. He couldn't imagine Kyajuro would be leading him somewhere harmful. Painful, maybe. The man's ideas of what counted as training seriously needed to adjust to the laws of human endurance. It wouldn't be outright harmful, though. When you first told me about sun breathing, there was something about it that struck me as familiar. I realized what it was a few nights back, Kyajuro said. Before or after Shinobu caught you trying to run laps around her mansion? Yoriichi asked. Kyajuro shivered. It had not been a pretty scene. He'd felt stronger and was chafing at the restrictions put on how far he could walk and how much he could do. He was a Hashira. He should be up and fighting, not lying on a bed taking his ease. The first 3 laps went by with hardly a coughing fit. The 10th had, admittedly, been hard for his stomach to bear. During the 15th, he'd collapsed and started hacking loudly. Unfortunately, he'd collapsed just outside Shinobu's office window. She must have peeked out and seen him because she was standing in front of him seconds later, a look of cheerful murder on her face. If you are feeling a bit restless, this might help you, she'd said, moments before proceeding to jam a needle into his arm. How Kyajuro made it to bed after that, he never knew. His entire body went limp seconds after the injection. He'd been forced to endure a long lecture on taking care of his body properly and the importance of following a doctor's orders. Due to whatever drug she'd pushed into him, he couldn't so much as crawl away to escape her. He'd hoped when the lecture finally ended that Shinobu would leave and let her drug wear off. She insisted on giving him another 2 doses to make sure he rested properly and undo the damage you did to your body, Rengoku. You have no one to blame but yourself. Spending 3 days unable to move had been hell. Kyajuro admitted. I had lots of time to think while I was stuck in bed. Not that it matters when I thought of it. Yoriichi nodded. With his perpetually blank face, it was hard to tell if he was being sarcastic or not. The Rengoku family has a tradition that every flame Hashira has followed. We read and maintain a record composed of flame-breathing techniques, demons, and other valuable information. Each flame Hashira is expected to read the chronicles and add any information gained within his lifetime to them. The tradition was started by the first flame Hashira. I myself learned flame breathing mostly by reading those records. Your father didn't teach you? Yoriichi asked. Kyajuro's smile twitched downward at the corners. The movement was so small and brief, Yoriichi barely caught it. He did teach me some of the basics, Kyajuro said. What is important is not how I learned flame breathing. It is what the first flame Hashira wrote when he began the record. He didn't begin in it with a lecture on the basic principles of flame breathing or information about Muzan Kibutsuji. The first few pages explain how all breathing techniques began and what their origin point was. Yorichi stopped walking and stared at Kyajuro's back. The flame Hashira continued on for a few more steps then turned. When you first spoke the name, Yoriichi Tsugikuni, I thought it sounded familiar. Like I had heard it before a long time ago. It was the same with sun breathing. Now I realize that my ancestor wrote about you. Kasajiri wrote about me, Yorichi said dumbly. Yes. I know you recall everything about your past life. You are more knowledgeable about sun breathing than any book could be. That being said, you have a right to read what was written. Not just to make sure it is accurate, but to understand the truth of the impact you have had. You speak as if you have no value. You pretend you never gave anything of worth to the world. You need to see that you have and will continue to do so. Yorichi stared at him. Kyajuro. He tried to think, to wrap his mind around what Kyajuro was saying. Kyajuro wanted Yorichi to read what Kasajiri had written about him. Would it be intrusive? Like he was digging into the mind of his dead friend without his permission? Are you sure? Those records are important to your family, Yorichi said. As are you. I meant what I said about you having a right, Kyajuro said. Yorichi looked down. I'm not sure it will give you the change you are hoping for. What I have achieved has never been enough to make up for my failures. I don't think it ever will. You are wrong, Kyajuro said. We can't define ourselves by our failures. I don't expect you to make an overnight transformation. But I think this might be a step on the path towards healing. As your teacher, I would be failing in my duty if I didn't make sure you took it. They started walking again, Kyajuro not speaking, but humming pleasantly as he walked. As they progressed, however, his face grew serious. Young Komado, I will admit that I have been keeping you away from the Flame Hashira estate. I apologize if you thought it out of malice or any judgment on your worth. There is a situation at my estate that is ongoing. If at any point I tell you to run or leave a room, you must obey without question. Yorichi murmured his acknowledgement and Kyajuro turned his attention back to the street. They passed 2 more turns before Yorichi spotted a familiar figure standing in the middle of the street with a broom in his hands. Tanjiro looked up from his task and dropped the broom in surprise when he saw the two of them. Tanjiro, he said. And big brother. Kyajuro grinned broadly and swept his much smaller brother up in a hug. It's good to see you, Tanjiro. I hope you are doing well. Welcome home, big brother, Tanjiro said, his voice muffled by his position against Kyajuro's chest. I am glad to see you are doing well. Releasing his brother, Kyajuro bent down and ruffled his hair. I am doing much better thanks to Shinobu and some rest. I see you've already met my Tsuguko, Tanjiro. Hi again, Tanjiro said shyly. Yorichi lifted an arm awkwardly and waved. Tanjiro, do you think you can, Kyajuro began. So you finally managed to limp home. The tone was harsh, the words spoken in a rough, deep, and slightly slurred voice. Yorichi and the 2 Rengokus turned toward the porch where the voice had come from. A man stood there, his clothes so loose most of his chest was exposed. His eyes were wild, his golden, red-tipped hair messy and several days' worth of stubble dotted his cheeks. In one hand, he grasped the rope around the neck of a large clay bottle of sake. The yeasty, sour smell of alcohol hung about him in a cloud. Worst of all was his presence. It was dark and sharp, needles growing into one another and pointing outwards at the same time. Yorichi had met demons with less malice and despair in them than this one man carried with him. So have you finally given it up? Realized that you will never be a great swordsman? Maybe nearly dying wasn't enough to jam that into your thick skull. The words seared Yoriichi's skin. How could anyone mock what Rengoku had just gone through like that? How could they wave his near death in his face like that? Father, Kyajuro said. His voice remained cheerful, but it sounded forced. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Glad to see you are doing well as always. I am doing good as well. Shinobu says I will be able to resume my duties within a month or so. No, I have not quit the Demon Slayer Corps. I am still the Flame Hashira. The man sneered and took several gulps of the sake jug. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he said, so you will have to die before you get it. Neither you nor I will ever be great swordsmen. Flame breathing is an imitation technique started by someone too weak to ever handle the original. The man's eyes fell on Yoriichi. Yoriichi's face was still blank, but his hands were slowly clenching into fists and he felt the beginnings of fury starting to smolder. You! He snarled. A sun breather. Did you come here to mock us? To pity us for being useless and talentless? For not being able to measure up to him, to Yoriichi Tsugikuni? Father, please don't. He came here to, Kyajuro interrupted. You don't even get it. You are in the company of one of the few blessed with talent and you still can't see it. I guess you will have to die before you can get it. Maybe that demon would have done you a favor had he managed it. With those words, Yoriichi's resolve finally broke. Shut up, Yoriichi said, his voice low. What did you say? Kyajuro's father asked. I told you to shut up, Yoriichi said. How dare you? How dare you disrespect your son and his sacrifice like that? Kyajuro is strong and talented. He saved over 200 people that night. It wasn't all for nothing. Kyajuro's father glared at him and then he moved. A normal person wouldn't have seen it. Kyajuro's father moved almost as fast as his son did when attacking. With his own speed and access to the transparent world, Yoriichi easily redirected the man's punch and jumped over the kick that followed. Careful, Sanjuro cried out as his father attacked again. Father is a former Hashira. Yoriichi dodged a few more strikes, redirecting, ducking, or blocking each one. Apologize. Apologize to Kyajuro right now, Yoriichi demanded. Tell him you didn't mean any of it. You didn't mean to wish your son was dead. You don't get to say that to me, Kyajuro's father roared. Not when you are a sun breather looking down on the rest of us from above. Something in Yoriichi snapped. He decided that he was done dodging. Stepping into the next strike, Yoriichi turned with the force of the blow and stepped forward, under the X-Flame Hashira's guard. First he sent an elbow to the man's gut, then landed a kick to his right knee, and finished with a punch to the man's jaw. Reeling, the X-Flame Hashira dropped to the ground, his eyes glazed. You don't get to do that either, Yoriichi snapped. You don't get to use me as an excuse to give up fighting and quit living your life. There are hundreds of people risking their lives right now to protect people from demons. Most of them know they will never be the best swordsman in the Corps or even make it to Hashira level. They fight anyway and every bit they contribute saves the lives of innocent people. You don't understand, Kyajuro's father growled, one hand on his injured face. You were always more than strong enough. Strong enough to protect the ones you loved. You're wrong, Yoriichi hissed. I failed them. I failed everyone who ever mattered to me including my own brother. Worst of all, I failed the two people I loved more than anything in the world. And if that wasn't enough, I got a second chance at life and I failed my family in this one too. You want to know what I found out through all that? You want to know what I realized? No one can ever be strong enough on their own, not even me. What we must do is try our best with our strengths, our talents, our gifts, everything we have been given, and do what we can. The X-Flame Hashira stared up at Yoriichi, eyes wide with shock. His mouth opened and shut a few times. You can't give up because you aren't the strongest. I haven't given up fighting. And I never will until Muzan Kibutsuji is destroyed and demons are gone from the world. To see you give up and try to take your sons down with you makes me sick. Kasajiri would have hated you. Let's all just calm down, Kyajuro said. Father, that bruise on your jaw looks nasty. We should get it seen to. Let me help you up. Wincing slightly, Kyajuro leaned down and held out a hand to his father. The ex-flame Hashira ignored the hand and rose to his feet. He shot one last hateful look at Yoriichi, then scooped up his abandoned jug of sake and stormed through the gate into the estate. That went about as well as could be expected, Kyajuro said brightly. He and Senjuro were alone in the kitchen. Senjuro had put the kettle on and was carefully measuring out tea. I've never seen anyone stand up to father like that, Senjuro said, his voice awed. He actually managed to land a few blows. Young Komado is quite, surprising, Kyajuro agreed. I'm just glad it ended without too many injuries. What he said about father using him as an excuse, though. What did he mean? Senjuro asked. Kyajuro winced and leaned his back against the nearest wall. He'd started to move quickly to break up the fight between his father and Tsuguko, but a single swift twitch had been enough to send a line of fire down his chest. Now he was still paying for his incautious actions. That I can't tell you. I wish I could, but the master says it has to remain a secret, Kyajuro said. If you would Senjuro, I would like you to look for the first flame-breathing chronicle. Could you please bring it to me and my Tsuguko along with the tea? Senjuro frowned. You want to show him the records? Yes, Kyajuro said. Then I will find it for you, Senjuro said. Thank you, Kyajuro said, and then his smile faded. For a moment, fighting upper 3, I thought I wasn't going to make it. During that time, I decided that I had something I wanted to say, a message I wanted to leave for you. Would you like to hear it? Senjuro blinked and looked apprehensive. Are you sure you want to tell me, big brother? Kyajuro nodded. Okay then, Senjuro said. I want you to follow the path you believe is right, no matter what happens. I know that this hasn't been easy for you. I wish I was able to shoulder more of the burden. Remember that your life is yours ultimately. Your beliefs, your wishes, your dreams. Senjuro's eyes widened and then the tears started to fall. I'm sorry, he sniffled, I don't mean to. Kyajuro wrapped him up in another hug. It's quite all right. We Rengoku have always been honest about what we feel. It is one of the traits I cherish most. The kettle started to whistle and Kyajuro released Senjuro. The younger Rengoku took the kettle off the heat and set it down. Thank you, big brother. I think I needed to hear those words, Senjuro said. Glad to hear it, Kyajuro said with a laugh, then his face turned somber again. Please find the chronicles for me, but take your time. I wish to have a private word with our guest. Kyajuro found Yorichi sitting on one of the long porches looking out into the courtyard. His posture was slightly slumped and he didn't turn around when Kyajuro settled down next to him, wincing from the pain in his still healing gut. I am sorry. Not for saying what I did or fighting with your father. I am sorry for any pain it caused you, Yorichi said. It's all right. Sometimes, Shinjuro, my father can be a bit much, Kyajuro said. You didn't have to defend me. I have endured his harsh words for years now. A few more won't hurt me. Kyajuro knew he was lying. Shinjuro had been harsh to him before and made no secret of his belief that Kyajuro lacked talent. He'd never said before that he wished Kyajuro would die. Hearing that from his own father had hurt. Hurt worse than any of his other personal attacks ever had. You shouldn't have to endure them, Yorichi said. For a father to treat his own child that way is unforgivable. Yorichi hesitated, then spoke again before Kyajuro could reply. I didn't just confront him to protect you. Shinjuro isn't the only one to give up because of me. Many slayers compared themselves to me and decided that training wasn't worth the effort because they couldn't reach my level. It didn't matter how many times I told them that they could find their own way or that they didn't need to be like me to help others. They simply stopped trying. On most other topics, they would listen to me. When I spoke to them about that one, they didn't listen. Kasajiri was one of the ones who never felt intimidated by me or my skills. To him, the creation of flame breathing was about finding his own way to fight. Seeing one of his own descendants abandon that way and give up, it was more than I could bear. You and Kasajiri were close friends? Kyajuro asked. He had known in an abstract way that Yorichi and the first flame Hashira had known each other. Kasajiri's own writings proved that. Hearing the evidence of it directly from Yorichi, though, made Kyajuro realize just how much older and more experienced the boy who had become his Tsuguko was. Yes, Yorichi said. He was the one who found me after. Yorichi stopped and took a deep breath. Kyajuro thought back to what Yorichi had said to Shinjuro about losing those who mattered the most to him. Who was it Yorichi had lost? After my wife and unborn child were killed by a demon, Yorichi said. The word struck Kyajuro like a physical blow. Most demon slayers joined the corps because they had experienced a demon attack. A majority of them had lost loved ones or even their whole family to demons. He'd never realized that Yorichi was among that number in his first life as well as his second. He tried to imagine what it would have been like had his mother been killed by a demon instead of her illness and failed. As one of the few who had inherited demon slaying as a profession, he had not lost any of his close family to demons. He could scarcely imagine the anger and the heartbreak Yorichi had gone through. For his part, Yorichi stared out into the courtyard, barely seeing the carefully tended paths or the koi pond. He became lost in his memories. Yorichi's tongue felt thick and swollen and his throat was dry. His clothes were stiff from dried blood. The skin on his arms as well as his neck had become tacky with the stuff. Still Yorichi cradled Yuta, his eyes fixed on her face with its glassy eyes dull of that vibrant cheer they always held in life. If he looked at her face, he could block out the torn-out throat and the bloody scratches covering her hands and chest. He didn't know how much time had passed and he didn't care. If he died of starvation or dehydration, he would join Yuta in the afterlife. Maybe he would get to meet their child there as well. It was all Yorichi wanted. When the door slid open, Yorichi didn't so much as twitch. Maybe if it was a bandit, he would be killed and reunite with Yuta all the sooner. Anyone else could go away and leave him to his fate. Through a haze, Yorichi felt a bright, fiery presence. A warrior of some kind, he thought. The door slid shut and the presence vanished. The stranger must have decided that Yorichi wasn't worth the trouble and gone on his way. A pity. He would have liked for the end to come sooner. For a time, Yorichi was left in peace, still holding his wife and waiting for death. Then the door opened again. Dully, Yorichi registered that it was the same bright presence from before. Footsteps echoed across the floor, but Yorichi didn't look up from Yuta's face to see where the stranger was. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. If you wish to honor their memory, you should bury them instead of dying alongside them, a voice said. Yorichi's eyes slowly drifted up from Yuta's face to meet golden eyes. The man standing in front of him had yellow hair tipped with red, like flames. The smile on his face was sympathetic and welcoming. Please, follow me outside, he said. Yorichi got his feet, his joints stiff and painful after sitting in the same position for so long. He pulled Yuta close to his chest and carried her bridal style as the stranger led him out the door. They continued down the path for a few feet before the stranger stopped at a small hill. A large hole had been dug at the top of the hill and there was a wooden board sitting next to the mound of dirt. How had the stranger known that this was one of Yuta's favorite spots? This spot is lovely and peaceful. I hope it will be a good resting place for her, the stranger said. Yorichi nodded. He stepped up to the hole, then gently lowered Yuta into it, treating her as if she were fragile, like one of those dolls his mother had always displayed in her room. Straightening up, Yoriichi looked down into the grave, unable to take his eyes off his wife's face. "Would you like to say a few words?" the stranger asked. Opening his mouth, Yoriichi tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He tried again. His thoughts were all in jumble. How could he reduce everything he felt about Yuta, everything he wanted to tell her, into something as simple as words? "It is all right," the stranger said, putting a comforting hand on his shoulder. "She will understand what you want to say even if you can't put it into words." The stranger's hand was warm and solid, comforting in a way that only a close friend's should have been. Yoriichi relaxed. Tears fell from Yoriichi's eyes as his grief at Yuta's death and overwhelming gratitude for the stranger's kindness whirled together and surged through his heart. After a few moments of silence, the stranger turned to the pile of dirt and began to push it towards the grave. Yoriichi watched him for a moment and then did his best to help. Together, they covered the hole and Yuta's body up. The stranger stuck the board upright in the dirt. "What was her name?" he asked. "Yuta," Yoriichi said, his voice rusty from disuse and lack of water. "And the child? What name had you decided on?" The stranger must have realized Yuta was pregnant. It was the only explanation for such a question. "Yuta didn't want to pick a name before the birth," Yoriichi said. "She wanted to see its face and decide then." "I see. Would you like to come up with a name now?" "Writing, baby, wouldn't make much sense." "Koku," Yoriichi said after a moment. "Yuta," said the baby, felt a boy, so it fits. "Koku is a strong name," the stranger said approvingly. He grasped the hilt of his sword and drew from his sheath. The blade was light red and polished to a shine. Yoriichi hadn't registered that the stranger had a weapon on him. Delicately, the stranger scratched Yuta's name onto the board and then the name, Koku, underneath it. Standing up, the stranger turned and started heading back towards the house. Yoriichi trailed behind him, face uncertain. The stranger coaxed Yoriichi into sitting down and then he left. Yoriichi stared at the door, heart pounding at the presence began to fade with distance. He didn't even know the stranger's name, yet the idea of him leaving and never coming back made Yoriichi feel panicked. The presence appeared again a few minutes later and began to come closer. Yoriichi let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The door slid aside and Kasajiri came in, a yoke with two of the beaten-up buckets Yoriichi and Yuta used for hauling water across his shoulders. He set down the water-filled buckets and reached for a dipper. Filling it, he thrust it at Yoriichi. "Drink," he ordered. Yoriichi obeyed. The water drew a cold, clear line down his throat and all the way to his stomach. It was all Yoriichi could do to drink slowly. "You should splash some on your skin too and scrub to get rid of the blood. If you have a change of clothes, I recommend getting into them," the stranger said. Yoriichi stared at him. The man had helped him bury Yuta and now he was caring for Yoriichi himself. "Who are you?" he asked. "I didn't introduce myself." "My apologies," the man said. "My name is Kasajiri Rengoku. It is a pleasure to meet you. Kasajiri is the one who convinced me to join the Demon Slayer Corps," Yoriichi said. "He told me I had a chance to help others avoid what I had gone through. It gave me purpose, a way to deal with my grief and use my strength for what it was meant for, protecting others. It also gave Yoriichi a reason to forego his desire to die and be with his family again." Yoriichi didn't voice that part. It felt too personal to say. "You look a lot like him," Yoriichi said, finally looking at Kyajuro. "When I first saw you at the trial, I thought you were him." Kyajuro winced. "I wouldn't apologize for what I said at the trial. I truly did think it would be best to execute you and Nezuko. However, I will admit that I was wrong about you both." "It's okay," Yoriichi said. "I don't hold what you said against you. I have long since reconciled that you and Kasajiri are not the same person. I do think that Kasajiri would have approved of you. You use your strength for the sake of others and are gentle and kind. Kyajuro smiled. I am glad to hear that, but I can't take the credit. It was my mother who taught me what my strength for. His smile faltered. She is who you lost, isn't she? The one your father said he couldn't protect, Yorichi said. Kyajuro nodded. We lost her to an illness when Sanjuro and I were young. Father has never been the same since. I see, Yorichi said. No other words came to him. He hated that Kyajuro had been forced to endure his father's abuse for so long. That Shinjuro's words about not being strong enough were not rational. He didn't think it would be appropriate to express any of that. The door behind them opened and Sanjuro appeared with a platter laden with a small teapot, 3 cups and several rice balls. He also carried a worn-out book under one arm. Setting down the tray, he handed the book to Kyajuro. I found the first Flame Hashira Chronicle, but there is a problem, he said. Kyajuro opened the book and Yorichi saw that several of the pages were torn, as if someone had ripped chunks of it out. Father probably did this, Kyajuro said with a sigh. But why? Why would he do such a thing? Sanjuro asked. The answer was plain to Yorichi. The book was how he had learned about Yorichi and his skills. When he started using Yorichi as an excuse to stop fighting, Shinjuro probably couldn't bear to have those words around him anymore. He'd torn them up in a rage. You have my apologies, young Kamado, Kyajuro said, bowing his head. It appears I will not be able to keep my promise. It isn't your fault. Blaming you wouldn't be fair, Yorichi said. To his surprise, he did feel a bit disappointed. It would have been nice to have a piece of Kasajiri back even if only for a moment. Maybe I can restore them, Sanjuro said. Kyajuro and Yorichi blinked then looked over at the youngest Rengoku. He flushed then looked down at the floor. I don't have any talent for swordsmanship. It doesn't matter how hard I train. I will never be at the level of a Hashira. That used to get me down, but I have come to realize that it's okay. I can find my own ways to help, my own ways to fight. If restoring this book will help you, then I'll do my best. Kyajuro put a hand on Sanjuro's shoulder and his brother looked up. I think that is a fine idea, Sanjuro, Kyajuro said. I believe you will be able to do it. You have my thanks. Sanjuro started and then smiled. His smiles were subtler than Kyajuro's, more gentle and fragile. They seemed to radiate the same warmth. They spent the rest of the visit eating, talking and, in Kyajuro's case, laughing. When it came time to leave, Sanjuro saw them both off. He watched until they disappeared down the road then went back inside the house. He was heading down the hall toward the kitchen, trying to remember what supplies he had to make dinner with when he heard a loud crash. Pausing, Sanjuro looked around, wondering where the noise had come from. A second crash sounded and then a third. They were coming from outside in the courtyard. Sanjuro ran for the door leading to the courtyard and found it already open, letting in the cold late afternoon breeze. He peeked around it and into the courtyard. Shinjuro stood in the courtyard with a jug of sake in his hands. As Sanjuro watched, his father hurled the sake jug. It landed a short distance away with a tremendous crash on a growing pile of clay shards which stank of sake. Reaching down, Shinjuro plucked another sake jug from the pile by his feet. Sanjuro recognized several of the sake jugs from around the house, but there were more he didn't recognize. Dimly, he realized that his father must have collected every sake jug from around the house, even the ones he'd hidden. Shinjuro uncorked the jug and held it to his lips. His grip tightened on the sake jug and he threw it onto the pile without drinking it. Sanjuro wasn't sure what to make of all this at first. Shinjuro had thrown sake jugs before, usually when he was angry at someone or something. He'd never thrown this many at once before. The destruction seemed systematic, deliberate. Slowly, Sanjuro retreated back behind the door and sat down hard. He didn't want to allow himself to feel it. After so long, he feared any kind of hope would be ripped to shreds. Even so, he couldn't help but allow himself one small sliver of it. Maybe, just maybe everything would be alright again in the Rengoku household. Before we get started, I'll need you to put in these earplugs and tie on this blindfold, the female Kokushi explained to Yorichi. Yorichi looked down at the strip of cloth and balls of fabric in his hands, feeling an immediate distaste. He'd done the same thing not long ago when they had gone to visit the master's mansion. While he understood the need for secrecy, wearing earplugs and a blindfold for so long was a pain. Obediently, Yorichi tied the blindfold around his eyes and wedged the plugs in his ears. He knew what was coming next, and it was his least favorite part of all. Sure enough, the Katsuhi shoved balls of fabric into his nose to act as nose plugs. That little lie about his magical sense of smell was really coming back to bite him. A strong hand descended on his shoulder and gave a brief squeeze. Likely, it was Kyajuro, giving Yorichi a bit of encouragement before he accepted his own blindfold and earplugs. The Kokushi hefted Yorichi up onto her back and started running. For the next couple days, Yorichi endured hours of riding on the backs of Kokushi. They were kind enough to stop every once in a while to give him water and food, but the pace was relentless. With fresh Kokushi taking over at irregular intervals, there was no need to stop for rest. Sleeping on the back of another person was not very comfortable, but there was little else to do on the trip. Once or twice, Yorichi contemplated telling the Kokushi carrying him that all these precautions were technically uselessly. Seeing the transparent world meant that no blindfold in existence could keep him from seeing where they were going. He wasn't planning on using the ability, though, and his gifts were still a secret. He had to suffer through the security precautions like everyone else did. Each time the Kokushi switched out, Yorichi thanked the one he was leaving and the one he was joining. He didn't say much to them, but each Kokushi's presence felt subtly touched or happy when he left them. Yorichi found that surprising. Did the other demon slayers show that little gratitude to the Kokushi? If anything, the Kokushi were more heroic than the demon slayers. Killing demons was more risky, but doing the hard work of putting everything back together and helping the survivors was more difficult and saved lives as well. The Kokushi should be treated as cherished comrades like any other demon slayer should. At last, a hand reached into Yorichi's ears and pulled out the balls of fabric obstructing them. Sounds rushed back into his head so abruptly, it made Yorichi feel slightly dizzy. We have arrived at the village. You may take off your blindfold and nose plugs, the Kokushi, another female one, said. Reaching up, Yorichi plucked the nose plugs out and felt immediate relief. The rough cotton had made the inside of his nose itch, like he was constantly on the verge of sneezing. Untying the blindfold, Yorichi lifted it from his face and then opened his eyes. They were in the mountains somewhere. Large boulders and rocky outcroppings framed the village. The houses were each several stories tall with grand sweeping roofs. Everywhere, there were people wearing masks. From the smallest children to a bent-over old grandmother. Each mask had odd, unique facial features. Quite a sight, isn't it? Kyajuro said cheerfully. He stood next to the tallest Kokushi Yorichi had ever seen. The Kokushi stood with his arms crossed and a proud set to his shoulders. Thank you for bearing me. It was an honor, Kyajuro said, bowing to him. Thank you, Yorichi repeated to the female Kokushi standing close to him. The female's eyes crinkled at the corners, suggesting she was smiling. The tall one simply nodded and tilted his head back a bit more, looking even more proud. You've been here before, Lord Kyajuro, so you know what to do next and where to go, right? The female Kokushi asked. Yes. We need to check in with the chief first, Kyajuro said. The female Kokushi nodded. She and the other Kokushi bowed, then left master and student standing along in the street. Kyajuro started down the street with Yorichi following close behind him. The Hashira smiled brightly at some of the passing villagers, even stopping to greet a couple by name. How often have you visited the Swordsmith village? Yoriichi asked. Several times, Kyajuro said. I came here the first time with my father. He wanted to make sure I knew the importance of the brave men and women who make our blades. His smile turned melancholy for a moment. During times of higher demon activity, Master will occasionally station a Hashira in the Swordsmith village just in case. I was stationed here for several months shortly after I first became a Hashira. I came to know its people quite well, Kyajuro said. The chief's house was the tallest building in the village. They were shown in by a pair of men in masks who sat down on cushions behind the chief when they entered. The chief himself was a surprisingly short man with a mask that looked like it was rolling its eyes in continual exasperation. Greetings, Kyajuro. It has been some time since last you visited. It is good to see you, the chief said, in high-pitched, almost childlike tones. Kyajuro bowed so low his forehead was touching the floor mats. Chief Tekken Tekikawahara, it is an honor to be here, he said. Respectful as always. Such a nice boy, the chief said. And who is this young man? Following Kyajuro's cue, Yoriichi pressed his forehead to the floor mats and spoke, Tanjiro Komado, sir. He is my Tsuguko, Kyajuro added. Such nice manners, the chief said. Both of you can sit back up now. Feel free to help yourself to some sweets. The chief indicated a large earthenware bowl of sweets sitting close to Kyajuro. Kyajuro offered the bowl to Yoriichi, but he declined. Sweets are good for you, Kyajuro declared, dropping a handful into Yoriichi's lap. Eat them. Dutifully, Yoriichi started to eat while Kyajuro began munching on handfuls from the bowl. I heard you both broke your blades in your last engagement, the chief said. I must apologize that our craftsmanship was not enough. Nonsense, Kyajuro said. We were up against an upper-rank demon. Without your steel to protect us, we never would have survived. Well, I can believe that of Kotetsu's work, the chief said, waving a hand. He is one of our finest and I have rarely found cause for complaint. As for Hotaru. The air in the room suddenly turned charged and Yoriichi felt the chief's presence, impressively large in contrast to his small body, churn with dark intent. That is a different matter. Hotaru? Yoriichi asked. You would know him as Haganezka, the chief said. I gave him his name, you know. Isn't it quite cute? Not sure of what else to do, Yoriichi nodded. Hotaru resents his name and me for naming him. Doesn't like that it's cute, the chief said with a sigh. He is missing at the moment, but don't worry about that. He loses his temper and runs off all the time. We'll find him. As he spoke those last few words, the temperature of the room abruptly plummeted again and the chief's presence once again radiated malevolence. The men on either side of the chief agreed with him, promising to drag Haganezka back as they cracked their knuckles and pounded fists on hands. It was an upper-rank demon, Yoriichi said. That my sword managed to last to the end of the fight was a miracle of craftsmanship. This is not the only time one of your swords has broken, the chief snapped. It is my fault for not using them properly, Yoriichi protested. No. It is his fault for creating swords that break, the chief hissed. If he is not found before it is almost time for you to leave, we will assign another to be your swordsmith. Yoriichi's heart sank. He wasn't getting through to the chief and with the anger he felt coming off the chief and both of his companions, Haganezka would be in for a beating when he was found. Yoriichi couldn't allow that. He bowed low, pressing his forehead into the mats for the second time that day. Please, don't punish him. He works hard to make me the blades I stake my life on and he cares about his work. I don't want him to be punished because of me. The chief said nothing for a moment and the tension in the air continued unabated. It is unusual to see someone so loyal to their swordsmith let alone to Hotaru, the chief said, his tone contemplative. If you insist that he not be punished, we will not do so. However, The chief's presence swelled and darkened again. He will receive a stern lecture and may be forced to take remedial lessons in swordsmithing. That last part sounded ominous. It was the best Yoriichi could hope for. He stayed bowed over a moment longer and then straightened back up. The tension had left the air and the atmosphere seemed normal again. I heard both of you were gravely injured during the battle with Upper 3, the chief said, his tone back to cheerful. Master asked that you both be allowed to stay until your swords and your hurts are mended. I intend to honor his request. While you are here, you should soak in our hot springs. They are good for injuries of all kinds. I'll have one of my aides show you both the way. The door opened and a younger man with a mouthless mask and a ponytail bowed to Kyajuro and Yoriichi. They said farewell to the chief and then followed him out into the village. As Kyajuro and their guide chatted, Yoriichi took in the village. The sound of hammers and clanking steel echoed through the streets. Everywhere he looked, there were doors open, displaying smiths working pieces of cherry-red metal on their anvils. Smoke belched clouds of black smoke from chimneys into the blue sky above. They are all so dedicated, Yoriichi thought. Most of these people have never seen a demon in life, but they played an integral role in stopping them. He wondered what drove their dedication. Most of the Demon Slayer Corps members had lost family to demons or had nowhere to go except the Demon Slayer Corps. That couldn't have been the case with a village like this. There were families strolling down its streets, buildings that had to be centuries old. Any wrong the demon had done to the swordsmiths must have occurred centuries ago. Yet they still continued in their unwavering dedication to make swords. Glancing at their guide, Yoriichi thought about asking him. He decided against it almost immediately. The man might think the loyalty of the swordsmiths was being challenged and Yoriichi didn't trust himself to put the question to the smith delicately enough for him to think otherwise. Yoriichi began to smell the strong sulphurous odor of the hot springs. It continued to grow as they left the village and approached the side of one of the mountains that framed the village. When they reached the foot of the mountainside, they found a stone-paved path leading up it along with some stone steps. There were signs pointing the way to the hot springs. The hot springs have all kinds of healing properties. It heals bruises, cuts, and, some even say, broken hearts, their guide said, stopping in front of the sign. Yes. The hot springs do feel great. I have soaked in them many a time, Kyajuro said. The path ahead will take you to the hot springs, the smith said. In the meantime, I will be down here helping to prepare your meal. You will be staying with me, so feel free to let me know if you need anything. You have our thanks, Kyajuro said. A wail split the air, making Kyajuro and Yoriichi jump and reach for swords that weren't there. They spun, almost in unison, to face down the path to the hot springs. Moments later, a wailing Mitsuri, wearing a flowery kimono and a red haori, was running down the steps toward them. She had tears in her eyes as she called out Tanjiro's name. She nearly ran into him before she stopped and began to sob out a story about someone in the hot springs who had been rude to her. Mitsuri, Kyajuro said, his voice low and dangerous. Tell me what the man looked like and I'll make him apologize. Jerking her tear-stained face away from Yoriichi, Mitsuri looked at Kyajuro. She pounced on him, wrapping him in a bear hug around the waist. A fully fit Kyajuro likely wouldn't have been moved. In his current condition, Kyajuro staggered back several feet. Kyajuro, she cried. When I heard about the fight with Upper 3, I was so scared. I thought I'd never see you again. Kyajuro's eyes widened for a moment and then he smiled softly, patting Mitsuri's hair with a free hand. His other arm snaked around her back, pulling her slightly closer to him. I'm okay, Mitsuri. You didn't lose me, he said. Mitsuri sniffled and clung tighter to him. Yoriichi could see all the fear about losing her old teacher, one of her best friends, still lurking in the corners of her mind. She needed a moment alone with Kyajuro, to take in the fact that he was alive. No mortal was promised an eternity, and demon slayers faced death on a nightly basis. There was no guarantee she'd get another moment like this. Yoriichi eyed the smith, who seemed to get the message. "I will be heading down to work on dinner. Remember to let me know if you need anything," he said, turning to go. "If it's all right, I'd like to go ahead and find the hot spring," Yoriichi said. "And warn any men I find lurking in it to clear out quickly." Mitsuri's relief at seeing him seems to have distracted Kyajuro, but I'd rather whoever was rude didn't stick around to face Kyajuro in full protective big brother/mentor mode. There was gratitude in Kyajuro's eyes as he spoke. "Good idea, young Komado. I will join you shortly." Yoriichi continued down the path until he reached a massive cloud of steam. Heading into it, Yoriichi discovered a massive hot spring with cloudy, greenish water. The smell was so strong, Yoriichi's eyes nearly watered. Something small and white came flying at his face, and Yoriichi caught it on instinct. Opening his hand, Yoriichi discovered a human tooth. Tossing it away, Yoriichi looked in the direction it had come from and spotted a head of long, dark, spiky hair. It took him a moment to recognize the other boy from initiation and his time at the Butterfly Mansion. "Genya. Genya Shinizugawa," Yoriichi said. Genya turned around and glared at Yoriichi. "What the hell do you want?" the boy demanded. "Who gave you permission to use my name?" 2 seconds into the conversation and he'd already put his foot in it somehow. Maybe it was what Yoriichi had done at initiation that had Genya mad. Yoriichi hadn't been thrilled with Genya's actions himself that day. That didn't mean they had to be enemies, though, or that the other boy was bad at heart. They'd all come through a rough, life-threatening trial and were exhausted. It wasn't shocking that one of them had snapped and done something they didn't mean. Yoriichi wanted to start over and act as comrades, maybe even friends. To do that, though, Yoriichi had to think of something to say. Should he ask Genya how he was liking the hot springs? Why he was in the Swordsmith village? Would the other boy get upset if he asked about the missing tooth? Well, say something. "Don't just look at me with that flat expression," Genya snapped. The yelling didn't help Yoriichi think, so he said the first thing that came to mind. "Does the water feel nice?" Genya glowered. Yoriichi must have said the wrong thing again. "Don't talk to me like we're friends. The water was just fine until you showed up," he growled. "What's with that flat tone anyway? If you are going to ask stupid questions, at least pretend to care about the answers." Yoriichi tried to think of another response, but Genya was already standing up and sloshing his way to the side of the hot springs. He climbed onto dry land and then snatched his clothes, dressing quickly and leaving without a backward glance. Yoriichi's usual failing at small talk had struck again. Sighing, he removed his clothes and tucked Nezuko's box safely under the shade of a tree. He'd have to visit the hot spring at night at some point so Nezuko could enjoy the water too. Slipping into the water, Yoriichi felt the heat working its way into his muscles, loosening them subtly. A deep breath of steam allowed the pungent, heated air to clean out his nose and bathe his throat. Wading into the middle of the pool, he sat and allowed the water to gently massage his body. Closing his eyes, Yoriichi let his mind drift away and relaxed. His awareness dropped away so completely that the next words he heard made him jump. "Feel free to relax, but remember not to let your breathing lapse. Even when resting, your breathing must remain constant, young Komado." Opening his eyes, Yoriichi turned to see Kyajuro standing in the water behind him. The Hashira's bright hair was loose, flowing down his back like a lion's mane. His chest bore several prominent, faded scars. Trophies from past battles fought. The biggest scar, however, was the most recent. It ran for several feet down his chest and the skin around it was a mix of purplish red. It was unnaturally straight, like it hadn't been made by a demon's claws at all. Yoriichi tried not to stare at it and failed miserably. Kyajuro smiled as Yoriichi forced himself to look away. "It is all right, young Komado. Shinobu had to cut me open to tend to some of my organs and stop internal bleeding. She did her job well and I will heal. There is no need to be afraid. Still, it was a visible reminder that Yoriichi had failed to protect someone yet again. He should have been strong enough to kill Akaza. To keep Kyajuro from getting hurt so badly. He should have. For a smart boy, you can be a particularly slow learner sometimes, Kyajuro said, his tone bright despite his words. My wounds are not your fault. I took them doing my duty and protecting civilians and my comrades. I bear them with pride and not shame. He paused and a shadow passed over his face. Besides, you saved me from a fate worse than death. If that demon had taken me to Muzan for turning, I cannot imagine what would have happened. The look on his face said that he had imagined it. Probably had nightmares about it if the slight bags under his eyes were any indication. Young Komado, I have a question for you. Well, free maybe, Kyajuro said. Yoriichi nodded slowly, signaling for him to continue. Given your situation, do you want me to keep calling you Komado or do you prefer Tsugikuni? Kyajuro asked. Frowning, Yoriichi pondered for a moment. In this life, he had been born a Komado and he bore the name of his friend's descendants with pride. But he had been Yoriichi Tsugikuni first and still thought of himself as Yoriichi. While part of him wanted to discard that name and forge a new path, his past life was undoubtedly a part of him and casting it aside was like denying his own identity. Call me Komado until the master has me reveal my identity, after that, you may call me Tsugikuni or Yoriichi, Yoriichi said. Kyajuro nodded. Very well. My second question is a bit more serious. Is it possible for a demon to use Muzan cells to turn a human into a demon without directly going to Muzan? Yoriichi tilted his head. I think it is possible, Yoriichi allowed. However, I do not think it would be done in your case. If what Muzan told me about it taking days for Michikatsu to transform is accurate, strong slayers are partially resistant to becoming demons. Getting second-hand blood might not work for a slayer at all. Even if it did, Muzan knows that it would take a while for the transformation to complete. He won't risk us killing the slayer during the transformation to prevent them becoming a demon. All indications point towards the demons needing to capture you and bring you to Muzan before you can be transformed into an upper rank. Closing his eyes, Kyajuro shuddered slightly. Thank you for your honesty. This next question is more of a favor I want to ask you. Know that I do not ask this lightly and I do so knowing what it will cost you. If Muzan succeeds and I am turned into an upper rank, I want you to promise that you will kill me. Yoriichi eyes stared at Kyajuro, eyes wide and expression visibly disturbed for once. Kyajuro met his gaze calmly, an earnest fire shining in his remaining. I remember what you said to Kibutsuji about taking back the lives he stole. Based on that, I realized your goal is not just to turn Nezuko back into a human or even to turn back your brother as well. You want to turn all of the stolen Hashira back into humans, Kyajuro said. It is a worthy goal. Worthy even of the risk it runs. However, I will not risk the lives of others on such a scheme for selfish reasons. If I can kill myself before being turned, I will. It is very possible that I will fail. I doubt I am the first Hashira to prefer death to becoming a demon. Likely, there are measures in place to stop me. If I do fail, I don't want to be responsible for the death of another human being. So I want you to kill me as soon as you are able. No, Yoriichi thought. I can't do it. Being responsible for someone I care about dying is bad enough. Actually killing them. It might be more than I can come back from. He can't ask this of me. He can't. Kyajuro was asking it of him, though, and the determined look on his face said refusal was out of the question. Why me? Yoriichi whispered. Why not ask the other Hashira? The other Hashira don't need encouragement, Kyajuro said. When they learn about who the upper moons once were, they will be horrified, maybe even shaken. They will still try to slay them in the end because that is what they have lived their whole lives doing and they can't see beyond that. They have a real chance of killing me should I go demon. Also, you might have the best chance. I have seen how you are growing. At your age, I had less than half of your current strength. You will grow into a fine Hashira. Perhaps the most powerful to ever live. If anyone has a chance of defeating me as a demon, it is you. Yoriichi looked down at the cloudy water around him. The relaxation he'd been feeling a few moments ago had vanished, blown away like steam on the wind. As he looked at his murky reflection, Yoriichi asked himself if he could do it. If he could kill a friend like that, even with that friend's permission. I don't know if I can make that promise, Yoriichi began. You must. Kyajuro interjected. I don't think I will know until that moment arrives. All we can do is trust that, in that moment, I will be able to make the right call. Do you trust me? Kyajuro nodded. With my life and more. Of course, it would be better if you don't get taken and turned into a demon. That means we will have try harder, train our hardest, and do everything we can to make sure it never happens. Can you do that? Yoriichi asked. That, young Komado, Kyajuro said. I can promise without hesitation. After that, the two slayers didn't speak for a time. Kyajuro felt tired and relieved like a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Since Yoriichi had revealed what Akaza had really meant to do that night, Kyajuro hadn't been able to close his eyes without having nightmares about it. He watched as he slaughtered Tanjiro and other junior slayers, Mitsuri and the other Hashira as well as the master, even his father and younger brother. The sight of their bodies, dead at his feet was terrifying. Far worse was the look of apathy in his demonic self's face as he did it. He'd killed them all and he hadn't even cared. During one particularly vivid nightmare, Akaza had appeared as the slaughter finished and slung an arm around his shoulders like they were friends. It is better than I imagined. You are perfect as a demon. No frailty, no petty empathy for weaker beings. Just incredible strength. And this is only the beginning. Think of how much stronger you will be when you have fed more. That particular time, Kyajuro had woken up with tears on his cheeks. He'd refused to go to sleep after that. Not even Shinobu's pointed and very creative threats had been enough to sway him. She'd had to force a needle with a sedative into his arm to get him back to sleep. Now, he felt that he'd settled matters and the nightmares he'd been having would remain nightmares alone. He could rest up, heal, and train without holding back. By contrast, Yoriichi found himself unable to relax for the rest of the time in the hot springs. The conversation had brought up too many disturbing thoughts and memories. It was almost a relief when Kyajuro stirred and said they needed to get dried off so they would be on time for dinner. Dinner was a raucous cheerful affair. Yoriichi watched in blank-faced shock as Kyajuro and Mitsuri both proceeded to pile up dirty dishes at a prodigious rate. His own stack of plates was modest and would have been more modest still if the two big eaters didn't take it in turns to push more food in front of him and urge him to eat it. Their host didn't appear surprised or put out by the amount of food being rapidly consumed. He simply appeared with fresh plates of food and cleared away the dirty ones as fast as he could. When Yoriichi apologized quietly, he chuckled and said, "Don't worry. We were told that Mr. Rengoku and Ms. Mitsuri would be stopping by. We know their needs and were given ample time to prepare." Nezuko had climbed out of her box early into dinner. She flitted around the table for a bit, eyes wide and curious, then strode up to Mitsuri, sticking her head out in a clear demand for pats. Mitsuri squealed in delight and stroked the demon girl's hair. Soon, Nezuko sat happily in Mitsuri's lap, soaking up the love Hashira's attention. The sight of his sister enjoying herself and bonding with Mitsuri warmed Yoriichi's heart. After the plates had been cleared away at last and the three sat talking, Nezuko clambered out of Mitsuri's lap and over to Kyajuro. She smiled up at him and then plopped herself down in his lap, resting her head against his chest. Kyajuro blinked and looked down at Nezuko in surprise. Yoriichi opened his mouth to apologize and call Nezuko back, but Kyajuro's face broke into a broad smile. He reached down with a gentle hand and began to stroke her back. Humming with pleasure, Nezuko leaned into him a little bit more, eyes half closed. As Yoriichi watched his mentor and his sister, he began to wonder what Kyajuro would have been like if he wasn't a demon slayer. Would he have married and had a daughter of his own? A family he could pour his energy and caring into? His family had been demon slayers for generations, so obviously there had to be some pressure for Kyajuro to continue the family line, but Kyajuro didn't seem to be looking for anyone to help him do that. Maybe he didn't want a family. All it took was one look at Kyajuro and Nezuko to prove that was a lie. His tenderness towards the younger slayers and the care he took in their training might be like a big brother, but he also had some fatherly qualities in him and he delighted in expressing them. For a moment, Yoriichi considered asking Kyajuro about it. He didn't. Both because it was too personal and because he guessed what the answer was. Life as a demon slayer and especially a Hashira meant death was around every corner. Kyajuro likely did not want to subject a wife to the constant worry and knowledge that one day, her husband would likely not come home. With the mark potentially limiting his time even more, Kyajuro would not change his mind. The talk turned to Mitsuri's reason for joining the Demon Slayer Corps. She giggled and blushed, acting all embarrassed. Kyajuro's loud coaxing and assurances finally got to her and she admitted that she joined the Demon Slayer Corps in hopes of finding a husband stronger than her. It is silly, I know, Mitsuri laughed. But I thought that if I became a Hashira, I was sure to find someone. It is not silly at all, Yoriichi said. He thought back to when he joined the Corps. How Kasajiri and the other had welcomed him, the sense of belonging he'd felt as they trained and fought as one. You are not the first person to join the Demon Slayer Corps in search of family, Yoriichi said. Mitsuri's eyes shone and happy tears gathered at the corners of her vision. You're the first person to say that to me. That is so sweet, she cried. The tears froze Yoriichi. Why was Mitsuri crying? Had he said the wrong thing again? Kyajuro pounded Yoriichi on the back and smiled, so obviously he hadn't said anything too terrible. A knock sounded on the door and it slid aside to reveal a masked man. He bowed and informed Mitsuri that the final adjustments were being made on her sword and she was needed. Mitsuri bounced to her feet and came around the table towards the door. She stopped beside Yoriichi and said, "There are rumors of a secret weapon that can make people stronger hidden somewhere in this village. I have been here for some time and never seen anything like what they describe," Kyajuro snorted. "They are just stories." Mitsuri drew herself up. "Even so. You might want to go looking for it while you stay here." Unsure what else to do, Yoriichi nodded and Mitsuri's smile grew. She said a cheerful goodbye to Kyajuro and then skipped out the door after the masked man. "We may as well retire. We are here partially to recover from our injuries, after all," Kyajuro said. Their host led them to their rooms and they bid each other good night. Yoriichi closed his eyes and dreamed of Yuta and a little boy with his red hair and Yuta's gentle face. The next morning, Kyajuro informed Yoriichi that he would have the day to himself. "I will be visiting Kotetsu. He has made blades for several generations of the Rengoku family and will be repairing my sword. Kotetsu is a dear friend and a genius swordsmith. I'd bring you to meet him, but he tends to get a little paranoid about his work and isn't fond of meeting new people. He will want to speak with me extensively before and during the smithing process. Says it helps him get a sense of the slayer's spirit so he can match the blade to them," Kyajuro said. "I'm not sure if that is true or if he just gets lonely. Either way, I will not be around much while he is working on the blade. As we are both still healing, now is the best time to take a break from training and repair our blades as well as our bodies. When training resumes though." Kyajuro paused and an intense, burning aura gathered around him. "Be ready to work hard." Internally, Yoriichi's sweat dropped as he pictured just how much hell he would be in for when training began again. The aura vanished and the normal, cheerful flame Hashira returned. Feel free to wander about the village and see the sights. It is too beautiful a day out for staying inside and there is much to see here. Perhaps we can visit some of my favorite spots if we have the time. So here Yorichi was wandering through the forest at the edges of the Swordsmith village. He'd thought about hanging around the village, but everyone in sight was so busy. The swordsmiths were hammering steel or gathering materials while their assistants stoked fires or went to repair tools. Some of the forges were open air and he'd watched, mesmerized for a few hours as they heated, pounded, folded, and stretched the steel. After a time, he'd felt in the way so he decided to take a walk in the forests. The peaceful bird song and rustling leaves were a welcome change from the constant clatter and clanging of the village. A light breeze ruffled his hair and he closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying its cool touch. An inquisitive sound came from Nezuko's box. "Something the matter, Nezuko?" Yorichi asked. A negative grunt and then another inquisitive sound. Yorichi wished Nezuko could use words. He couldn't understand what she was trying to communicate. A light rapping came from inside the box, like Nezuko was hitting repeatedly. Another inquisitive sound. If Yorichi interpreted the rapping to mean a fight and the sound to be a question. Nezuko was asking about a fight or... "You are wondering about the weapon Kanroji told us about," Yorichi guessed. An affirmative grunt came from the box. "I think what Kyajuro said was probably right," Yorichi said. "There are always rumors, even in closed-off places like this. I doubt there is a weapon to be found." Nezuko made a disappointed sound then went quiet. Yorichi listened for a few more steps. Nezuko was being quiet so maybe she had gone to sleep or was thinking. Sounds registered on the edge of his hearing. They were not grunts or further sounds from Nezuko. Somebody was shouting at the top of their lungs. Reaching out with his awareness, Yorichi felt a large powerful presence swirling around in a smaller, brighter childlike presence. The childlike presence reverberated with anger and dread. Hand on the hilt of his sword, Yorichi sprinted towards the presences. He didn't feel a demon nearby and the bigger presence felt human. That didn't mean it was human. Demon blood arts constantly evolved and there was every chance one had been created to fool him. Two figures came into sight between the trees. Yorichi recognized the slender, powerful form of the mist Hashira, Michiro Takedo. His oddly unfocused eyes swirled with a vague rage while his strangely familiar features were set like stone. In front of him stood a child wearing a mask with red round dots for cheeks and a pointy nose. The child's hands were clenched into fists and his eyes were fixed on the Hashira. Takedo was the focus of his anger and dread. Yorichi hid himself behind a tree and searched the area with his eyes and senses for demons or other people. He found nothing out of the ordinary, apart from a crate on the ground behind Takedo. Takedo and the boy seemed to be arguing about something Takedo wanted. The boy was angrily refusing to give it to him while the mostly passive Hashira continued to insist. Hesitating, Yorichi watched as the argument continued. Whatever they were arguing about had nothing to do with him. Should he turn away and pretend he didn't see them? They probably wouldn't welcome being interrupted and he had no idea how to defuse the situation. With his social skills, he'd probably make things worse instead of better. Turning away, Yorichi started to walk away. The solid thwack of flesh on flesh halted him in his tracks. Whirling around, Yorichi saw the child on the ground with Takedo standing over him. Takedo reached down and grasped the child by the front of his red vest, holding him in the air. In a flash, Yorichi was out of the trees and standing inches away from Takedo and the child. "Put him down now. You cannot hurt a child like this," Yorichi demanded. Takedo looked at Yorichi, his expression unimpressed and eyes expressionless. "Who are you and why are you being so noisy?" "I told you to put the child down," Yorichi said. Takedo glanced at the boy he was dangling above the ground as if to make sure he knew what Yorichi was talking about. "We are just having a conversation." It is rude to interrupt, Takedo said. I am not going to ask again. Let the boy go, Yoriichi said, hands tightening into fists. Think you're strong enough to threaten me, Takedo scoffed. His grip tightened. Go away while I'm feeling generous. Fury ignited in Yoriichi's veins, pulsing through his veins and into his rapidly tightening muscles. In a heartbeat, he'd crossed the remaining distance between himself and Takedo. He watched as Takedo started to move, tightening his grip and shifting his stance. The muscles in one leg contracted, giving away Takedo's next move. Sliding past Takedo's outstretched knee, Yoriichi hit his wrist at a precise angle. The hand holding the boy spasmed and released. Takedo leaned forward and went for Yoriichi's nose with one of his elbows. Yoriichi ducked the blow and grabbed the back of the boy's shirt. He sidestepped the Hashira's punch and turned with the force of the next one, narrowly avoiding both hits. Yoriichi managed to open up some space between them and stopped. He gently put the boy on the ground and scanned him with his eyes and the transparent world. You are not hurt, he confirmed. I'm fine, the boy shouted. Takedo was holding his wrist, regarding Yoriichi with a confused expression. You are stronger than you look, he said. You might even be able to keep up with me for a few minutes. But fighting would be pointless. I would simply make him give the key to me after you lost. I am not giving the key to either of you, the boy yelled. Torture me all you want. You'll get nothing. Torture. What would a child like you know of torture? You can't even fathom it, Takedo scoffed. I don't know what this key is or why it is valuable, Yoriichi said. What I do know is that I am not letting you hurt child. Quit calling me a kid. I'm old enough to take care of myself, the boy shouted. Letting me, Takedo said, tone contemplative. I do not think you are letting me do anything. A shadow passed over Takedo's face and his expression hardened. It is not your place to let a Hashira do anything. I will do what I please and you are not strong enough to stop me. Takedo drew his sword and flowed into a fighting stance. Last chance. Back down before you get hurt, he said. Yoriichi pulled his sword, the temporary one he'd been offered by his host that morning, from his belt. He didn't draw it from the scabbard. Hurting a child was wrong and so was maiming Takedo. The mist Hashira was both a comrade and barely older than a child himself. Yoriichi refused to use a sharp blade. A dull blade and some pain, however, wasn't out of the question. Launching himself forward, the mist Hashira raised his sword for an overhead chop. Yoriichi spun away from it and circled to Takedo's right. He leaped to avoid a blow aimed for his legs and bent to avoid a second one on track for his torso. Takedo flowed smoothly from one strike to another, the break between his attacks nearly invisible. His strikes had the graceful, flexible curves of water breathing, intermixed with unexpected twists, lunges, and angles. In terms of speed, they were about even. The unpredictability of Takedo's moves meant that Yoriichi had to be constantly watching and interpreting through the transparent world. With the sheath still on the sword, Yoriichi's blade was bigger and clumsier. Takedo easily parried or avoided most of his blows. You are strong, Takedo commented. You might even have the potential to be a Hashira one day. But you can't win this. Why not draw your sword? At least then, you can make it harder on me. Yoriichi didn't respond. He twisted out of the way of a strike and then leaped over Takedo's head. He feinted towards Takedo's legs then switched suddenly to Takedo's torso. Takedo's eyes widened and his sword came up a fraction of a second too late. Yoriichi's sheathed blade skidded over the top of Takedo's blade, slamming into the Hashira's spine in a palpable hit. The two broke apart. Takedo rubbed his back, his usually confused expression now dark with rage. You are wasting my time, Takedo snapped. My time is far more valuable than yours or that of a mere swordsmith. Think of how many people are dying while we quarrel over something meaningless. If it breaks, make another one. It's as simple as that. Have you ever fought a demon without a sword? Yoriichi asked. Takedo tilted his head and blinked. Huh. If you had, you'd know how valuable a mere swordsmith is. Without a sword, all you can do is delay the demon and hope it doesn't run when the sun comes up. We would all die if it weren't for the swordsmiths. They are fighting just as much as you and me, but in their own way. You shouldn't insult them, Yoriichi said. Shaking his head, Takedo looked past Yoriichi's shoulder at the boy still sitting on the ground. There are dozens of swordsmiths and only a few Hashira. It is their duty to serve us. I don't have time to waste on heartfelt nonsense like yours, Takedo said. He sheathed his sword and then struck like a snake for Yoriichi's neck. Yoriichi grabbed his wrist and flipped over his head, slamming him into the ground on his back. What do I have to do to make you understand? Yoriichi demanded. Takedo stood up and dusted himself off. I've had enough, he announced. His swirling aura flashed with anger like miniature thunderclouds. If that boy doesn't give me the key, I'm going to make this hurt. I'm done being gentle. Yoriichi gritted his teeth. His body already ached and a line of pain marked the newest scar on his stomach. In his condition, he wasn't going to last long against Takedo. You should run, Yoriichi told the boy. I'll try to delay him as long as possible. No, the boy said. I told you. I don't need anyone to protect me. So just leave already. Putting himself between Takedo and the boy, Yoriichi held his still-sheathed sword in front of his body. You probably can't outrun him, so hiding would be the best option. Then get to Kyajuro Rengoku or find the chief. They'll help you. Takedo took a step forward and Yoriichi saw him tensing for a lunge. All right. All right already. I'll do it. I'll give you the key. The boy yelled. Both Yoriichi and Takedo froze and looked at him. The boy puffed out his chest. I'm not letting anyone take hits for me. This is just so I won't be in this strange scarred boy's debt. You got that. The boy disappeared and then reappeared a few moments later with a small, intricately carved key. He dropped it into Takedo's waiting palm. Without a word, the mist Hashira turned and started marching towards the wooden crate. Now that Yoriichi was close enough, he could see that it was the right size and shape to hold an adult man. Sobbing, the boy whirled around and took off into the forest. Yoriichi shot one last glance at Takedo, who was completely absorbed in the crate and whatever it contained. He raced after the child. He found the child a short distance away, hidden up a tree with his face tucked into the trunk. Curled into a ball, the child was sobbing. He's going to break it. It's all my fault for giving him the key. All my fault, the child whispered. What is he going to break? Yoriichi asked. The child jumped and twisted his head around to see Yoriichi sitting on a branch not far away from him. How did you find me? The boy demanded. I have a very good sense of smell, Yoriichi informed him. Swordsmen sure are scary, the boy grumbled. Still. It doesn't change that I gave him the key to make the doll move and now he is going to smash it to pieces. Doll. Yoriichi tried to picture the stoic Takedo playing house with dolls like a little girl and couldn't. The boy was too old and too serious for it. What kind of doll is it? Yoriichi asked. A very special kind, the boy said. The doll is a training tool for swordsmen. It is a marvel of engineering that no one in my family has been able to repeat since. I certainly have no chance of repairing it, let alone making another one. Thanks to me, my family's legacy is gone. Nice going, Kotetsu. The boy curled in on himself and began to sob again. His mask was slightly askew, showing a small nose, plump cheeks, and a small mouth. Kotetsu. Is that your name? Yoriichi asked. Why yeah, the boy said. What is yours? Tanjirou Komado, Yoriichi said. It is nice to meet you, Kotetsu. Thanks for standing up for me earlier. No one ever did that for me before, Kotetsu said. Then he stared crying again. I am such a loser. I have no talent. No place in this village at all. Stop that, Yorichi said. You have plenty of talent. You have enough courage to stand up to Hashira and the kindness to protect someone you had just met. You aren't a loser at all, Kotetsu. Just because you are on a different path from your ancestors doesn't mean your path is worthless. Everyone contributes to this world in their own way. Kotetsu sniffled. He wiped his eyes with a corner of his sleeve and then his nose. Reaching up, he settled his mask completely over his face once more. I decided earlier that I didn't want to watch the training because I couldn't stand to see that arrogant jerk break it. Now, I know I have to see this through. Combat training will last until nightfall. I will see it through to the end. Carefully Kotetsu climbed down the tree and started heading towards the sound of clanging metal. Yorichi easily leaped down to follow, making Kotetsu jump once more and mutter about the scariness of swordsmen. Soon, they reached a large clearing where a battle was taking place. Takedo swayed and struck, his movements fluid and graceful in a way no dancer could equal. He flowed out of the way of attacks and surged forward, his blade flickering in nearly unpredictable patterns. 6 swords struck at him from all angles, forcing him to twist and leap to avoid being struck. The way he moves is amazing, Yorichi thought. His complete awareness of his own body and how it fits in with the surroundings is incredible. While he was dodging 6 blades, the Hashira did not seem hard-pressed. His eyes darted from blade to blade, seamlessly keeping track of each one and its trajectory. The blades were keeping him busy and were pressing him, but not overtaking him. Still, for his opponent to give him this much of a challenge, the doll had to be incredible. Amazing, isn't it? Kotetsu said, his voice ringing with pride. It is the battle doll built by my ancestors. Yorichi's gaze traveled from the doll's long red hair and red kimono up to its face and stopped. Half its face was already shattered, the gears and pulleys inside clearly visible. However, Yorichi could clearly make out the red eyes, blank expression, and the slayer mark curling across a pale forehead. Dangling from the doll's ears were Hanafuda earrings, a perfect match to Yorichi's own. It can't be, Yorichi thought. It isn't meant to be. Modeled after the first breath using swordsman, its name is Yoriichi Type 0. So it was true. Somebody had modeled a murder doll, battle doll after Yorichi.